The Administratum maintains an extensive classification system for the millions of worlds within the Imperium, and feral worlds occupy a distinct category that reflects both their primitive state and their potential value to the Imperial war machine. According to official designation criteria established by the Adeptus Terra, a feral world is defined as any inhabited planet where the dominant human population has regressed to or remains at a pre-black powder technological level. This classification distinguishes them from feudal worlds, where gunpowder weapons and basic metallurgy exist alongside medieval social structures, and from death worlds, where the primary classification factor is environmental lethality rather than technological regression. The Administratum scribes record feral worlds with specific notation marks in the great ledgers of the imperial tithe system, designating them as limited yield worlds with reduced material obligations, but elevated potential for human recruitment. These worlds typically cannot provide manufactured goods, refined materials, or substantial food exports. Instead, their value to the Imperium lies almost exclusively in their populations, which often produce physically robust individuals suitable for Imperial Guard regiments, or, in rare cases, Space Marine recruitment. The Adeptus Militarum maintains separate assessment protocols for these worlds, recognizing that standard tithe expectations applied to civilized or hive worlds would be meaningless when applied to populations that have yet to rediscover iron smelting or organized agriculture beyond subsistence farming. The distinction between feral and feudal worlds sometimes blurs at the boundaries of classification, particularly on worlds where isolated pockets of higher technology exist alongside predominantly primitive populations. The Administratum resolves these ambiguities through strict adherence to specific technological markers. A world where the majority population utilizes stone tools, bone weapons, and lacks any form of metallurgy beyond occasional copper working receives feral designation regardless of whether a small noble class might possess ancient metal weapons passed down as heirlooms. The absence of reproducible metalworking technology serves as a key criterion. Similarly, the complete lack of written language among the general population, while not absolutely required for feral classification, typically accompanies such designations and reinforces the assessment of technological regression. The causes behind a world's descent into or persistence at feral technological levels vary considerably across the Imperium. The most common origin traces back to the Age of Strife, that terrible period between the 25th and 30th millennia when warp storms isolated human worlds from one another, and the nascent Imperium could not yet reunite scattered humanity. Countless colony worlds found themselves cut off from supply lines, technical support, and the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. On many such worlds, the initial colonists possessed advanced technology, but without the industrial base to maintain or reproduce it, equipment failed over generations. Populations fragmented, knowledge disappeared, and within centuries or millennia, descendants of starfaring colonists hunted with spears in forests that grew over the ruins of their ancestors' landing sites. Old Night, as this period is also known, created feral worlds through simple isolation and entropy. A mining colony established during the Dark Age of technology might have relied entirely on imported machinery and off-world technical expertise. When the warp storms came and ships stopped arriving, the machinery eventually broke down. Without replacement parts or the knowledge to fabricate them, the colonists faced a choice between adaptation and extinction. Those who survived did so by abandoning their technological dependence and reverting to methods their distant ancestors would have recognized. Stone tools require no maintenance schedules. A bow needs no power cells. Oral traditions persist where data cores fail and corrode. Xeno's devastation accounts for another significant proportion of feral world origins. The galaxy teems with hostile alien species, and many human worlds have suffered catastrophic attacks that destroyed their technological infrastructure while leaving survivors to rebuild from nothing. Orc invasions particularly demonstrate this pattern. The greenskins often descend upon human worlds in vast numbers, their crude but effective weapons overwhelming defensive forces. After the orcs move on to their next target, the human survivors emerge from hiding to find their cities reduced to rubble, their factories destroyed, and their technical specialists dead. Without the knowledge base to reconstruct what was lost, these populations regress rapidly. Within a few generations, the descendants of factory workers and void ship crew become hunters and gatherers, picking through the ruins their grandparents once inhabited. The Adeptus Mechanicus occasionally creates feral worlds through deliberate quarantine actions, though the tech priests rarely acknowledge this publicly. When a world suffers catastrophic technological contamination, heretical machine spirit corruption, or dangerous archaeotech awakening, the Mechanicus sometimes determines that complete technological regression represents the safest solution. They evacuate or eliminate the technical infrastructure, destroy all advanced technology, and leave the population to devolve naturally. The Mechanicus maintains monitoring stations in these systems, ensuring no one rediscovers the dangerous knowledge that prompted the quarantine. These worlds remain classified as feral indefinitely, their populations unknowingly serving as biological placeholders, preventing other forces from claiming systems the Mechanicus intends to reclaim once the perceived threat has degraded sufficiently. Catastrophic system failures during the Age of Strife created some of the most thoroughly regressed feral worlds. Certain colony worlds depended entirely on automated systems and artificial intelligence for basic survival functions. When these systems failed, either through the warp storm's effects or the violent emergence of the Men of Iron during humanity's ancient civil war against its own creations, the colonists lacked even basic survival skills. The resulting die-offs eliminated most of the population, and the survivors possessed no technical knowledge whatsoever. Their descendants, evolving over millennia without even the memory of their technological past, developed cultures entirely divorced from their origins. Some of these populations worship the decaying remnants of ancient machines as gods, not recognizing them as human creations. Population distribution on feral worlds typically follows patterns dictated by available resources and environmental conditions rather than any form of organized planning. Tribal structures dominate, with groups ranging from extended family units of 20 or 30 individuals to larger confederations numbering several hundred. These tribes maintain territories based on hunting grounds, water sources, or defensible locations. Competition for resources drives inter-tribal conflict, and warfare conducted with primitive weapons remains a constant feature of life on most feral worlds. The absence of unified planetary governance is absolute. No feral world maintains anything resembling a global authority, and most populations remain unaware that other continents or hemispheres on their own world contain human populations. Clan hierarchies within tribes vary according to local cultural evolution, but certain patterns recur across multiple feral worlds. Strength and martial prowess typically determine leadership, as survival in primitive conditions favors those who can hunt effectively and defend their people against threats. Shamanic or spiritual leaders often hold significant influence, interpreting natural phenomena and maintaining oral traditions that preserve fragments of practical knowledge disguised as ritual or myth. Some anthropologists within the Adeptus Terra have noted that certain feral world religious practices contain corrupted echoes of technical procedures, suggesting that even completely regressed populations retain subconscious cultural memories of their technological past. The demographic characteristics of feral world populations interest the Adeptus Militarum considerably. These populations typically exhibit high birth rates coupled with high mortality rates, particularly among children. Warfare, predation, disease, and simple accidents claim many lives before adulthood. Those who survive to maturity, however, demonstrate physical resilience and combat capability that civilized worlds rarely produce. The constant struggle for survival creates natural selection pressures that favor strength, endurance, and aggression. Imperial recruiters recognize these populations as valuable sources of soldiers who require minimal adaptation to military life, as they already understand violence, hardship, and tribal loyalty that transfers readily to regimental brotherhood. Imperial assessment protocols for feral worlds follow procedures distinct from those applied to more developed planets. When the Adeptus Terra identifies a feral world, either through explorator fleet surveys or rediscovery of lost colony records, assessment teams deploy to evaluate the population's viability for Imperial purposes. These teams, usually consisting of Munitorum officials accompanied by armed escorts, conduct observations from orbit or establish concealed monitoring stations. Direct contact with the primitive populations is generally avoided during initial assessment phases, as the Administratum recognizes that premature exposure to Imperial technology can disrupt useful cultural characteristics or trigger cargo cult behaviors that complicate future recruitment efforts. Assessment teams evaluate multiple factors when determining a feral world's classification and tithe obligations. Population size receives primary consideration, as worlds with insufficient numbers cannot sustain regular recruitment without risking demographic collapse. The Munitorum typically requires populations of at least several million distributed across sustainable tribal networks before authorizing regular tithes. Smaller populations receive monitoring status, with reassessment scheduled for future centuries when natural growth might support recruitment. Physical characteristics of the population undergo scrutiny as well. Populations showing signs of severe mutation, of human traits beyond acceptable parameters, or genetic degradation receive different classifications, or, in extreme cases, face exterminatus protocols if the deviation suggests chaos taint or xenos contamination. The Adeptus Munitorum pays particular attention to cultural factors that might affect recruitment success. Warrior cultures that emphasize martial prowess and honor receive favorable assessments, as such populations produce soldiers who adapt readily to Imperial Guard doctrine. Populations demonstrating excessive pacifism, elaborate taboos against violence, or religious beliefs incompatible with Imperial truth face rejection or require extensive reconditioning that reduces their recruitment value. The presence of tribal warfare actually increases a world's assessment rating, as populations experienced in organized violence transfer more easily to military service than those from peaceful societies. The Great Crusade's expansion across the galaxy during the late 30th millennium brought the Imperium into contact with countless feral worlds scattered throughout previously isolated sectors. The expeditionary fleets that pushed outward from Terra encountered these primitive human populations with increasing frequency, and the protocols developed for their integration into the Imperium reflected both pragmatic military concerns and the ideological imperatives of the Emperor's vision for unified humanity. These encounters required careful management, as populations that had regressed to Stone Age conditions often possessed no framework for understanding the armored giants who descended from the sky claiming to represent humanity's rightful government. Expeditionary fleet protocols for contacting pre-industrial populations evolved considerably during the early decades of the Great Crusade. Initial approaches varied depending on the fleet commander's temperament and the specific circumstances of contact, but certain standard procedures emerged as the crusade progressed. Fleets typically conducted extensive orbital surveys before making surface contact, identifying population centers, tribal territories, and any signs of warp contamination or xenos influence. These surveys allowed commanders to assess whether a world warranted peaceful integration or required more aggressive compliance measures. The presence of obvious chaos corruption or hostile xenos structures occupying the same world as human populations often resulted in immediate military action rather than diplomatic overtures. When orbital assessment indicated a relatively uncorrupted human population suitable for integration, expeditionary fleets deployed specialized contact teams rather than immediately committing military forces. These teams included members of the Iterator Corps, that now extinct organization of orators and philosophers tasked with spreading the imperial truth throughout newly compliant worlds. The Iterators understood that populations living in tribal conditions, surrounded by dangers they could barely comprehend, often developed elaborate mythologies and superstitions to explain their reality. The sudden appearance of spacecraft and power-armored warriors could easily slot into these existing belief structures in counterproductive ways, creating cargo cults or religious devotion that contradicted the imperial truth's atheistic materialism. The Iterator Corps approached feral world populations with calculated patience, recognizing that cultural integration required different methods than those applied to more technologically advanced societies. On civilized worlds, iterators could engage with existing governmental structures, presenting logical arguments for imperial compliance backed by demonstrations of technological and military superiority. Feral world populations lacked such structures and often possessed no conceptual framework for understanding interstellar civilization. Iterators assigned to these worlds spent months or even years living among the tribes, learning local languages and customs, while gradually introducing imperial concepts through careful cultural manipulation. Iterators working on feral worlds faced the challenge of explaining the Imperium's nature without overwhelming populations that might never have conceived of lands beyond their immediate territories, let alone other planets or star systems. They typically began by establishing themselves as wise outsiders bearing useful knowledge, teaching practical skills like improved agriculture, basic medicine, or more effective hunting techniques. This approach built trust while demonstrating that the Imperium offered tangible benefits rather than mere abstract promises. Once populations accepted the iterators as beneficial presences, the orators gradually introduced larger concepts: the existence of other tribes beyond the horizon, the presence of hostile aliens in the galaxy, the idea that all humans shared common ancestry and destiny under the Emperor's guidance. The Imperial Truth's atheistic doctrine created particular difficulties on feral worlds where animistic religions or spirit worship pervaded every aspect of tribal life. Iterators could not simply dismiss these beliefs as primitive superstition without alienating the very populations they sought to integrate. Instead, they employed sophisticated rhetorical strategies that reframed spiritual concepts in materialist terms. Tribal gods became metaphorical representations of natural forces. Ancestral spirits transformed into cultural memories of past generations. Shamanic visions received explanation as psychological phenomena rather than genuine supernatural experiences. This gradual recontextualization allowed populations to maintain cultural continuity while accepting imperial truth principles, though the success of these efforts varied considerably depending on how deeply embedded religious practices were in tribal survival strategies. The establishment of administratum monitoring stations on compliant feral worlds represented the first permanent imperial presence these populations encountered. These facilities, typically constructed in remote locations away from major tribal territories, served multiple functions. They housed the small contingents of imperial personnel responsible for overseeing the world's integration, maintained communication equipment for regular reports to sector authorities, and provided secure storage for weapons and supplies necessary to maintain imperial authority. The stations also served as recruitment centers where tribal warriors selected for Imperial Guard service would gather before transport off-world, and as bases for periodic compliance inspections, ensuring the population remained free of chaos, corruption, or Xenos infiltration. Monitoring station personnel faced the ongoing challenge of maintaining imperial authority without excessive interference in tribal affairs. The Administratum recognized that feral world populations' value lay partly in their primitive conditions, which produced the hardy warriors the Imperium desired. Excessive modernization or cultural disruption could eliminate the very characteristics that made these populations useful. Station commanders therefore operated under strict guidelines limiting their intervention in tribal conflicts, cultural practices, or territorial disputes unless such matters threatened imperial interests. Tribes could war among themselves with traditional weapons, but any group attempting to resist imperial recruitment tithes or showing signs of chaos worship faced immediate military response from the garrison forces stationed at these facilities. recruitment protocols implemented on newly compliant feral worlds followed patterns established by the Adeptus Munitorum based on early Crusade experiences. The Imperium could not simply conscript entire tribal populations without devastating the demographic base needed for sustained recruitment across multiple generations. Instead, recruitment teams worked with tribal leaders to establish selection processes that identified promising warriors while maintaining population stability. Young males of appropriate age who demonstrated combat prowess in tribal warfare or hunting expeditions became primary candidates. The Munitorum typically established recruitment quotas based on planetary population size, extracting enough individuals to fill Imperial Guard regiments while leaving sufficient breeding populations to ensure future generations would provide similar yields. Space Marine legions participating in the Great Crusade approached feral world compliance with methods reflecting their distinct cultures and strategic doctrines. The Space Wolves, whose home world Fenris itself qualified as a feral world by administratum standards, demonstrated particular effectiveness when dealing with Fenrisian analog worlds where harsh conditions and tribal warrior cultures prevailed. The 6th Legion's approach to these populations emphasized respect for martial traditions and personal prowess rather than the cultural re-education favored by Iterator Corps personnel. Space Wolves commanders often participated directly in tribal combat rituals, demonstrating their superiority through personal combat rather than technological advantage. This approach resonated with warrior cultures that valued individual strength, and populations that might have resisted Iterator rhetoric often accepted Space Wolves' authority after witnessing their combat capabilities firsthand. The Space Wolves' compliance methods on worlds resembling Fenris typically involved minimal disruption to existing social structures. They identified the strongest tribes and integrated their leaders into imperial authority frameworks, essentially creating a hierarchy where tribal chiefs answered to Space Wolves' overseers who ensured imperial compliance. This system allowed populations to maintain their traditional ways while acknowledging imperial sovereignty. The 6th Legion also established recruitment practices on these worlds that mirrored their own selection processes, seeking young warriors who demonstrated the aggression and resilience necessary for potential Space Marine candidacy. While most recruits ultimately served in Imperial Guard regiments rather than joining the Space Wolves themselves, the Legion maintained close relationships with these worlds, viewing them as extensions of Fenris's warrior culture across the galaxy. The White Scars brought different methodologies to feral world compliance, particularly when encountering nomadic populations on worlds with vast steppes or plains. The 5th Legion's approach reflected their Chagorian heritage and understanding of tribal societies organized around mobility and mounted warfare. White Scars commanders recognized that nomadic populations could not be managed through fixed monitoring stations or sedentary recruitment protocols. Instead, they established mobile compliance systems where imperial representatives traveled with the tribes, moving according to seasonal patterns and maintaining authority through continued presence rather than fortified positions. This approach proved remarkably effective with populations that viewed permanent settlements with suspicion and valued freedom of movement as essential to their cultural identity. The White Scars' compliance actions on worlds hosting nomadic cultures often involved participation in great hunts or tribal gatherings, where multiple groups converged for trade, competition, and social exchange. Legion representatives attended these events, demonstrating their riding skills and combat prowess in traditional contests, while simultaneously conducting recruitment assessments and reinforcing imperial authority. The 5th Legion understood that nomadic populations respected strength and skill, but resisted overt domination, so they positioned imperial compliance as a partnership between equals rather than submission to superior force. This subtle approach achieved integration while preserving the nomadic lifestyle that produced the swift, adaptable warriors the Imperium valued from these populations. Resistance to imperial compliance on feral worlds manifested in patterns distinct from those encountered on more technologically advanced planets. Civilized worlds might resist through organized military opposition or political maneuvering, but feral world populations typically lacked the coordination or resources for sustained conventional resistance. Instead, opposition emerged through cultural rejection, rooted in deeply held superstitions and religious beliefs that framed imperial contact as spiritually dangerous or cosmologically wrong. Tribes whose entire worldview centered on appeasing local spirits or maintaining taboos against outsiders sometimes chose extinction over compliance, retreating into inhospitable territories or engaging in suicidal attacks against imperial forces rather than accepting integration. Superstition-driven rejection of the imperial truth created significant complications for compliance efforts. Iterators might spend years building relationships with tribal populations, only to have their work collapse when shamanic leaders declared the Imperium's presence spiritually polluting or prophesied disaster from accepting imperial authority. These religious rejections often proved immune to rational argument or demonstrations of imperial benefits, as populations operating within magical thinking frameworks interpreted everything through their existing belief structures. Imperial technological superiority became evidence of sorcerous corruption rather than advanced engineering. Iterator rhetoric transformed into dangerous lies designed to trap souls. Even practical benefits like improved medicine or agriculture faced rejection as spiritually tainted gifts that would bring long-term catastrophe despite short-term advantages. Military responses to sustained feral world resistance remained relatively restrained during the Great Crusade compared to actions taken against more developed rebellious populations. The Imperium recognized that feral world populations possessed limited capacity for organized resistance and that their primitive weapons posed minimal threat to imperial forces. Punitive expeditions against resistant tribes typically involved targeted strikes designed to eliminate leadership and break tribal cohesion rather than wholesale slaughter. Expeditionary fleet commanders understood that these populations represented valuable recruitment resources despite their resistance, and unnecessary casualties reduced the demographic base the Imperium sought to preserve. Resistant tribes faced destruction of their settlements and forced relocation to areas under direct imperial supervision, but outright extermination remained rare unless populations demonstrated chaos taint or proved completely intractable. Warp-tainted populations discovered on feral worlds presented entirely different challenges, requiring immediate assessment for potential exterminatus consideration. The isolation that created feral worlds also left them vulnerable to chaos corruption, as populations lacking technological defenses or understanding of the warp's dangers could fall to demonic influence without recognizing what had befallen them. Expeditionary fleets encountering feral worlds where tribal practices involved obvious chaos worship, populations displayed widespread mutation suggesting warp exposure, or demonic manifestations occurred with regularity, faced difficult decisions about whether these worlds could be salvaged through compliance actions or required complete sterilization. The threshold for exterminatus consideration on feral worlds remained lower than for more developed planets, reflecting both the population's limited strategic value and the reduced political complications of destroying primitive societies. A hive world hosting billions of citizens and producing vital war materiel might receive extensive purification efforts even if chaos cults had infiltrated significant portions of its population, as the economic and demographic loss of exterminatus outweighed the risks of attempted salvation. A feral world hosting perhaps a few million tribespeople offered no such strategic value, and the risk that chaos corruption might spread to imperial personnel conducting compliance operations often tipped decisions toward complete destruction. Fleet commanders who discovered feral worlds where entire populations participated in demonic rituals, or where the warp had so thoroughly saturated the environment that reality itself had grown unstable, rarely hesitated to authorize orbital bombardment rather than risk their forces in futile compliance attempts. The biospheres of feral worlds span an extraordinary range of environmental conditions, from barren post-apocalyptic wastelands, where scattered tribes eke out survival among the ruins of previous civilizations, to lush death-world jungles, where megafauna populations dominate ecosystems and shape the warrior cultures of indigenous humans forced to compete with creatures that dwarf them in size and strength. The Administratum's classification system recognizes these environmental variations through subsidiary designations that append additional information to the primary feral world classification, though the bureaucratic machinery of the Imperium often reduces complex planetary ecosystems to simple categorical markers that fail to capture the full scope of conditions affecting human populations. Worlds classified as post-apocalyptic feral environments typically bear the scars of ancient catastrophes that devastated their biospheres during the Age of Strife or earlier periods of human expansion. Archaeological surveys conducted by explorator fleets frequently uncover evidence suggesting these worlds once supported advanced civilizations with populations numbering in the billions, their surfaces covered by sprawling cities and industrial complexes. The catastrophes that reduced these worlds to their current states varied considerably. Some suffered nuclear exchanges during the wars that consumed humanity during Old Night, their surfaces scorched by atomic fire that left lingering radiation in certain regions, and reduced once thriving metropolises to fields of fused glass and twisted metal. Others experienced ecological collapse when terraforming systems failed catastrophically, triggering cascading environmental disasters that stripped away carefully cultivated biospheres and left only the hardiest organisms clinging to survival in marginal ecological niches. The tribal populations inhabiting these devastated worlds live among constant reminders of their ancestors' fall from technological grace. Ruined cities serve as territorial boundaries between competing tribes, their crumbling structures providing shelter during harsh seasons, while simultaneously presenting dangers from unstable architecture and the predatory creatures that lair in collapsed buildings. Some tribes develop elaborate mythologies around these ruins, interpreting the decaying remnants of ancient technology as the works of gods or demons rather than recognizing them as human creations. Tribal warriors scavenge among the wreckage for materials useful in their primitive existence, prying metal panels from collapsed structures to fashion into crude weapons or tools, unaware that the corroded fragments they hammer into spearpoints once formed hull plating on orbital defense platforms or civilian transport vehicles. The radiation that lingers on many post-apocalyptic feral worlds creates additional survival pressures that shape tribal cultures in distinctive ways. Populations develop elaborate taboo systems around certain territories, where radiation levels remain lethal even millennia after the initial catastrophe, declaring these areas cursed or haunted by malevolent spirits. Tribes whose territories border these contaminated zones suffer higher mutation rates, and their cultures typically develop harsh practices for dealing with visibly mutated offspring. Some populations practice exposure of mutant infants, leaving them in the wilderness to die or be claimed by predators. Others maintain exile traditions, where mutants receive banishment from tribal territories, creating populations of outcast communities that survive in marginal lands between tribal holdings. The Adeptus Munitorum monitors mutation rates carefully during recruitment assessments, as populations with excessive genetic damage produce fewer viable candidates for Imperial service. Lush death world environments represent the opposite extreme of the feral world spectrum, where aggressive biospheres teeming with dangerous life forms create constant threats to human survival. These worlds typically possess atmospheres with higher oxygen content than standard human baseline, supporting the enormous organisms that characterize their ecosystems. The megafauna inhabiting these planets evolved in response to abundant resources and high oxygen environments, developing body masses that would prove unsustainable on less fecund worlds. Creatures measuring 6 meters at the shoulder or stretching 20 meters from snout to tail tip occupy ecological niches that smaller organisms fill on more typical worlds, and human populations must contend with predators capable of treating armed warriors as prey items rather than threats. The impact of megafauna on indigenous warrior cultures cannot be overstated. Tribes living on death worlds, where massive predators roam, develop martial traditions centered entirely around cooperative hunting techniques and defensive strategies designed to protect settlements from creatures that can demolish crude fortifications with casual strength. Young warriors prove their worth through participation in hunts targeting dangerous prey, and tribal hierarchies reflect success in these endeavors. A warrior who has killed one of the great beasts earns status that no amount of success in intertribal warfare can match, as fellow tribespeople recognize that bringing down a creature weighing several tons with primitive weapons requires courage, skill, and tactical thinking far beyond what human-scale combat demands. The weapons and tactics employed by Death World populations reflect their environmental pressures. Tribes develop specialized hunting equipment designed specifically for penetrating the thick hides and dense muscle masses of megafauna targets. Spears feature elongated points capable of reaching vital organs through layers of protective tissue. Bows achieve draw weights that would cripple users from less demanding environments, their arrows tipped with bone or stone points designed to cause massive bleeding in enormous prey animals. Hunting parties employ coordinated tactics, where groups of warriors work together to isolate individual creatures from herds, drive them into prepared killing grounds, or exploit terrain features that negate the size advantages megafauna possess. These cooperative combat methods translate remarkably well to Imperial Guard service, as warriors accustomed to coordinating attacks against creatures vastly larger than themselves adapt readily to squad-level tactics against enemy forces. Failed terraforming projects from the dark age of technology created many of the hostile environments that forced human populations into technological regression and adaptation. During humanity's golden age before Old Night, colonization efforts employed sophisticated terraforming techniques designed to transform marginal or hostile worlds into habitable environments suitable for large-scale settlement. These projects manipulated planetary atmospheres, introduced carefully selected organism populations to establish functional ecosystems, and sometimes altered planetary orbits or rotational characteristics to optimize climate conditions. The systems maintaining these artificial environments required constant oversight and periodic adjustment, as terraformed biospheres lacked the stability of naturally evolved ecosystems and could collapse rapidly if supporting technology failed. When the Age of Strife severed colony worlds from the technical support networks that maintained their terraforming systems, many carefully crafted environments began degrading immediately. Atmospheric processors that had maintained breathable air compositions shut down, allowing carbon dioxide levels to rise or oxygen concentrations to fall toward levels that stressed human populations. Introduced species that had been kept in check by automated culling systems experienced population explosions, overwhelming ecosystems, and driving other organisms to extinction. Climate control networks failed, causing weather patterns to destabilize and creating extreme seasonal variations that the original terraforming had eliminated. Within centuries, worlds that had been transformed into paradises reverted to hostile conditions, and the human populations inhabiting them faced the choice between adaptation and extinction. The populations that survived on failed terraforming worlds developed physical and cultural characteristics shaped by their degraded environments. Worlds where atmospheric oxygen content dropped below optimal levels produced populations with enhanced lung capacity and more efficient oxygen utilization, their bodies adapting across generations to function in thinner air. These populations typically inhabited mountainous regions or high plateaus where they could access the highest oxygen concentrations available, developing cultures centered around altitude and viewing lowland areas as cursed territories, where the air itself sickened those who ventured there too long. The Adeptus Munitorum values recruits from these populations for service in mountain warfare regiments or deployments to low-oxygen worlds where standard troops require supplemental breathing equipment. Atmospheric and gravitational variations across different feral worlds produce populations with enhanced physical characteristics that the Imperium finds particularly desirable for military recruitment. High-gravity worlds, where surface gravity exceeds standard human baseline by 20% or more, force populations to develop exceptional strength and bone density simply to function in their native environments. Children growing up under increased gravitational stress develop denser skeletal structures and more powerful musculature than their counterparts from standard gravity worlds, and adults from these populations demonstrate physical capabilities that approach the lower ranges of human strength without crossing into mutation territory that would disqualify them from Imperial service. The Space Marine chapters pay special attention to feral worlds with high-gravity environments when selecting recruitment worlds, as populations adapted to increased gravity possess physical foundations that better survive the transformation into Astartes. The gene seed implantation process places enormous stress on recipient bodies, and candidates from high-gravity worlds demonstrate higher survival rates during the transformation than those from standard environments. Their bones can better support the additional mass of enhanced organs and power armor, and their cardiovascular systems adapt more readily to the increased demands of superhuman physiology. Several chapters maintain exclusive recruitment rights to specific high-gravity feral worlds, viewing these populations as optimal sources for potential battle brothers. Low-gravity feral worlds produce populations with different but equally useful characteristics. Humans adapted to reduced gravity develop enhanced agility and spatial awareness, their bodies learning to function in environments where momentum carries differently, and falls from significant heights pose less danger than on standard gravity worlds. These populations often inhabit canyon systems or mountainous terrain where vertical movement forms a normal part of daily life, and their cultures develop elaborate climbing traditions and aerial mobility techniques. Warriors from low-gravity worlds demonstrate exceptional balance and coordination, making them valuable candidates for reconnaissance units, void warfare specialists, or any military role requiring operation in zero-gravity or reduced-gravity environments. Seasonal extreme conditions on many feral worlds create cyclical patterns that define tribal calendars and establish predictable warfare seasons based on environmental factors rather than purely cultural considerations. Radiation storms represent one of the most significant seasonal threats on worlds with damaged magnetospheres or orbital paths that periodically carry them through regions of intense stellar activity. These storms manifest as invisible waves of hard radiation that sicken exposed populations and prove lethal to those caught without shelter during peak intensity periods. Tribal populations on radiation storm worlds develop extensive knowledge of storm patterns, recognizing atmospheric signs that presage incoming radiation events and maintaining emergency shelters where communities can wait out the dangerous periods. The cyclical nature of radiation storms shapes warfare patterns on affected worlds in predictable ways. Tribes schedule raids and territorial conflicts during calm seasons when radiation levels remain within tolerable ranges, knowing that sustained campaigns become impossible once storm season approaches. Warriors caught far from shelter when storms arrive face agonizing deaths from radiation sickness, their bodies failing over days or weeks as cellular damage accumulates beyond repair. This environmental constraint forces tribal warfare into compressed timeframes, creating intense conflict periods followed by enforced truces during storm seasons when all populations must focus on survival rather than inter-tribal competition. The Adeptus Munitorum finds these populations particularly adaptable to void warfare environments, as their cultural familiarity with invisible environmental threats that require technological protection translates well to understanding the dangers of hard vacuum and cosmic radiation. Predator migration patterns create different seasonal pressures on death worlds, where megafauna populations move across vast territories following food sources or breeding imperatives. Tribes inhabiting regions along major migration routes must either relocate their settlements seasonally to avoid the massive herds that would trample permanent structures, or develop defensive systems capable of redirecting migration flows around their territories. Some populations construct elaborate barrier systems from logs and earth, creating channels that guide migrating creatures past settlements rather than through them. Others time their own seasonal movements to coincide with predator migrations, following the great herds at safe distances and exploiting the ecological disruption the migrations create to hunt smaller prey animals displaced by the passing megafauna. The arrival of migrating predator populations triggers intense competition for hunting territories among tribes, as the brief period when enormous prey animals pass through specific regions represents the primary opportunity to secure meat supplies sufficient for lean seasons. Multiple tribes converge on migration routes, establishing temporary camps and negotiating or fighting over hunting rights to particular sections of the migration corridor. These seasonal gatherings serve multiple cultural functions beyond pure subsistence, providing opportunities for trade, mate selection, and resolution of disputes accumulated during the isolation of off-season periods. Young warriors prove themselves during migration hunts, and tribal alliances form or dissolve based on cooperation or conflict during these critical seasons. Resource scarcity cycles driven by climate variations or ecological factors create additional seasonal pressures that shape tribal calendars and warfare patterns. Worlds with extreme axial tilts experience dramatic seasonal changes where temperatures swing between life-threatening extremes, forcing populations to migrate between summer and winter territories or develop sophisticated storage systems for preserving food through harsh seasons. Water availability fluctuates on worlds with irregular precipitation patterns, creating wet seasons of relative abundance followed by drought periods when tribes must rely on carefully maintained wells or natural springs that become focal points for territorial conflict. The predictability of resource scarcity cycles allows tribal populations to develop elaborate cultural responses that the administratum's anthropological observers find remarkably sophisticated despite the population's overall technological primitiveness. Tribes maintain complex oral calendars tracking seasonal patterns across multiple years, preserving knowledge of which years in longer cycles will bring particularly harsh conditions requiring additional preparation. Shamanic leaders often serve as repositories for this temporal knowledge, their status within tribes depending partly on their ability to accurately predict seasonal transitions and advise on appropriate responses to approaching scarcity periods. Some populations develop elaborate ritual systems around seasonal transitions, performing ceremonies designed to ensure favorable conditions or appease the spirits they believe control whether patterns and resource availability. Tribal confederation systems on feral worlds emerge from practical necessities rather than abstract political philosophies, as populations scattered across hostile environments discover that cooperation between related groups provides advantages that isolated bands cannot achieve alone. These confederations typically form around kinship networks where multiple tribes trace their lineage to common ancestors, maintaining genealogical knowledge through oral traditions that extend back dozens of generations despite lacking written records. The bonds between confederated tribes manifest through regular gatherings where leaders negotiate hunting territories, arrange marriages between groups to strengthen alliances, and coordinate responses to external threats that exceed any single tribe's capacity to address. Warriors from confederated tribes recognize obligations to support their allies during conflicts, creating military forces that can number in the hundreds when multiple groups combine their strength against common enemies. The internal structure of these confederations varies according to environmental pressures and cultural evolution specific to each world. Some populations develop hierarchical systems where a paramount chief drawn from the strongest tribe exercises authority over subordinate leaders, their position maintained through demonstrated military success and the ability to distribute resources captured during raids or hunts. Other confederations operate through consensus-based councils, where representatives from member tribes gather to debate courses of action, with decisions requiring agreement from all parties before implementation. The Space Wolves recognize these confederation patterns from their own Fenrisian origins, where the strongest Jarls commanded respect from lesser chieftains, while maintaining their positions through constant demonstration of superior prowess. Chapters descended from Leman Russ's gene line often seek recruitment worlds displaying similar political structures, as populations accustomed to following powerful leaders, while maintaining fierce individual pride produce space marines who balance pack loyalty with personal honor. Blood feuds between tribes or confederations represent one of the most persistent features of feral world societies, creating cycles of violence that span generations and shape territorial boundaries through accumulated grievances rather than formal agreements. These feuds typically originate from specific incidents where one group inflicts harm upon another through killing of warriors, theft of resources, or violation of territorial boundaries, but the initial cause often becomes obscured across decades as each generation adds new injuries to the tally of wrongs requiring vengeance. Tribes maintain detailed oral records of feuds, with designated remembrancers reciting the history of conflicts during gatherings to ensure young warriors understand which groups their people consider enemies and why continued hostility remains necessary. The obligation to avenge fallen kin creates binding expectations that individuals cannot ignore without facing exile or death from their own people, as populations living in constant danger cannot tolerate members who refuse to participate in collective defense and retaliation. Honor-based warrior societies develop naturally on feral worlds where survival depends on martial prowess, and populations must maintain reputations for strength to deter aggression from neighboring groups. These cultures construct elaborate codes defining acceptable behavior for warriors, establishing standards that members must meet to retain status within their communities. The specific requirements vary between populations, but certain patterns recur across multiple worlds. Warriors must demonstrate courage by facing dangerous prey or enemy combatants without fleeing regardless of personal risk. They must show skill in weapons use and tactical thinking by achieving success in hunts or battles. They must display loyalty to their tribe by prioritizing collective welfare over personal safety and sharing resources according to cultural expectations rather than hoarding for individual benefit. The Space Wolves find populations organized around honor codes particularly suitable for recruitment, as Fenris itself operates according to similar principles, where warriors earn status through demonstrated prowess and maintain it through continued achievement. Young Fenrisians selected as Space Wolves aspirants already understand the fundamental concepts that the chapter emphasizes during training, making their transformation into Sky Warriors less culturally jarring than it would be for recruits from populations lacking martial traditions. The White Scars similarly value honor-based societies, particularly those emphasizing mobility and swift strikes rather than static defense, as these cultural characteristics align with the chapter's own doctrines inherited from Jagatai Khan's Chagorian heritage. Populations that practice mounted warfare or develop raiding traditions focused on speed and sudden violence produce recruits who instinctively grasp the lightning war tactics that define White Scar's combat methodology. The Salamanders approach recruitment from feral worlds with different priorities than chapters emphasizing pure martial aggression, seeking populations that balance warrior prowess with strong community bonds and protective instincts toward non-combatants. Nocturne, the Salamander's home world, maintains a culture where warriors serve as protectors of their communities rather than simply raiders or hunters, and the chapter seeks similar characteristics in other recruitment populations. Feral worlds where tribes emphasize defense of settlements and care for vulnerable members rather than pure conquest and resource extraction receive favorable assessment from Salamander's recruitment teams. These populations produce space marines who embrace the chapter's focus on civilian protection and measured application of force rather than the berserker fury or relentless aggression that other chapters cultivate. Shamanistic traditions pervade nearly all feral world cultures, filling the explanatory void created by technological regression and providing frameworks for understanding phenomena that populations lack scientific knowledge to interpret correctly. Shamans serve multiple functions within their tribes, acting as spiritual leaders who communicate with ancestor spirits or nature gods, as healers who treat injuries and illnesses with herbal remedies and ritual practices, and as repositories of oral traditions preserving practical knowledge disguised as myth or religious instruction. The line between genuine practical wisdom and pure superstition blurs considerably in shamanic practices, as effective herbal medicines exist alongside completely useless ritual behaviors, and useful survival knowledge gets transmitted through stories about spirits and gods rather than straightforward instruction. Benign ancestor worship represents the most common and least problematic form of shamanistic practice from the Imperium's perspective. Tribes practicing ancestor veneration maintain elaborate traditions honoring deceased warriors and leaders, believing that the spirits of the dead continue watching over their descendants and can provide guidance or protection if properly respected. These practices typically involve regular ceremonies where shamans recite genealogies and recount the deeds of notable ancestors, reinforcing tribal identity and providing moral instruction through examples of honored predecessors. Offerings of food or valuable items get placed at burial sites or sacred locations associated with important ancestors, and warriors seek spiritual strength before battles by invoking the names of renowned fighters from previous generations. The Administratum tolerates ancestor worship on compliant feral worlds because these practices rarely interfere with imperial recruitment or create vectors for chaos corruption. The Ecclesiarchy's missionaries recognize that populations venerating their ancestors can be gradually redirected toward proper worship of the emperor without requiring complete cultural destruction. Shamanic traditions emphasizing respect for the dead and learning from past generations align reasonably well with imperial cult doctrines about honoring the emperor's servants and maintaining faith in humanity's righteous path. Missionaries working on these worlds typically employ syncretistic approaches, incorporating existing ancestor veneration into broader imperial religious frameworks by presenting the emperor as the ultimate ancestor of all humanity, whose example all lesser forebears attempted to emulate. Chaos-tainted shamanistic practices present entirely different challenges, requiring immediate inquisitorial intervention and potential exterminatus consideration if corruption has spread too deeply through the population. The warp's influence manifests insidiously on isolated feral worlds where populations lack any understanding of demonic threats or the dangers of psychic phenomena. Shamans who possess latent psyker abilities might unknowingly open themselves to warp entities during trance states or ritual practices, believing they communicate with ancestor spirits or nature gods while actually channeling demonic influences. These corrupted shamans gradually introduce practices that serve chaos powers, teaching rituals involving blood sacrifice, encouraging excessive violence beyond what survival requires, or promoting behaviors that feed specific chaos gods through emotional excess. The progression from benign shamanism to chaos worship often occurs so gradually that populations fail to recognize the corruption spreading through their cultures. A shaman who begins receiving visions from what he believes are powerful ancestor spirits might start advocating for ritual combat, where warriors fight to the death to honor the dead, not realizing he channels Khorne's influence. Tribes that traditionally practiced modest ancestor offerings might escalate to elaborate blood sacrifices after shamanic leaders claim the spirits demand greater devotion, creating feedback loops where warp entities gain strength from the emotional energy generated by increasingly extreme practices. Populations can descend into complete chaos worship across just a few generations, their original benign traditions twisted beyond recognition, while tribal members believe they simply follow the ways of their ancestors more faithfully than previous generations. Inquisitors assigned to monitor feral worlds maintain strict protocols for identifying chaos corruption in shamanistic practices. Certain markers indicate probable warp taint requiring immediate investigation. Ritual practices involving deliberate torture, cannibalism beyond survival necessity, or sexual excess suggest chaos influence, regardless of how populations rationalize these behaviors through cultural tradition. Shamanic leaders displaying obvious mutation or demonstrating abilities that exceed what untrained psychers should possess warrant immediate detention and interrogation. Tribal populations showing collective psychological changes toward excessive aggression, despair, obsessive behavior, or hedonistic excess indicate possible corruption by specific chaos powers, as these emotional patterns align with the domains of the ruinous powers. Ecclesiastical ray education programs deployed on feral worlds showing early-stage chaos corruption attempt to salvage populations before taint spreads beyond recovery. Missionary teams accompanied by armed militarum tempestus units establish fortified positions and begin systematic cultural intervention, identifying and eliminating corrupted shamanic leaders while introducing imperial cult practices to replace tainted traditions. These programs operate through combination of force and persuasion, executing individuals who resist conversion while offering imperial protection and material benefits to tribes that accept ray education. Young warriors showing minimal corruption get separated from their tribes and transported off-world for intensive indoctrination before potential recruitment into penal legions or redemption through military service. The success rate of these interventions varies considerably, as populations deeply invested in corrupted practices often resist violently rather than abandon traditions they believe essential to their survival and identity. Oral tradition preservation of distorted Dark Age myths creates fascinating anthropological puzzles that administratum scholars study to understand how technological knowledge degrades across generations when populations lose the context necessary to interpret inherited information correctly. Tribes on post-apocalyptic feral worlds often maintain elaborate story cycles describing the achievements of ancient ancestors who supposedly commanded god-like powers, not recognizing these tales as corrupted memories of the dark age of technology when their worlds hosted advanced civilizations. The details preserved in these myths sometimes contain fragments of genuine technical information, though so thoroughly embedded in supernatural frameworks that extracting useful knowledge requires extensive analysis by tech priests familiar with archaeotech principles. Cargo cult worship of ancient technology represents one of the most common manifestations of distorted Dark Age memories on feral worlds, where populations live among ruins containing recognizable artifacts from their ancestors' civilization. Tribes develop elaborate religious practices around non-functional technology, believing that proper ritual observance will cause ancient machines to activate and provide the miraculous benefits their myths describe. Warriors perform ceremonies before corroded vehicles, chanting words they believe represent sacred invocations, but which actually constitute corrupted fragments of activation codes or maintenance procedures. Shamans maintain custody of broken tools or weapons, treating these items as holy relics imbued with spiritual power rather than recognizing them as mundane objects that once served practical functions. The Adeptus Mechanicus monitors cargo cult activities on feral worlds with particular interest, as these populations sometimes preserve knowledge about archaeotech locations or functions that even the tech priests have forgotten. Explorator teams occasionally deploy to feral worlds where tribal myths describe ancient facilities or artifacts matching descriptions of Dark Age installations, using shamanic legends as guides to locate buried technology. The tech priests approach these investigations carefully, as populations that worship ancient machines often react violently to outsiders attempting to access or remove sacred relics. Mechanicus teams must either negotiate with tribal leaders for access to holy sites or employ military force to overcome resistance, with the choice depending on the perceived value of potential archaeotech discoveries versus the cost of violent intervention. Deified remembrances of the Emperor as a tribal war god appear on numerous feral worlds that achieved compliance during the Great Crusade or early imperial period. Populations that encountered the emperor's forces during initial contact sometimes developed religious frameworks interpreting the Imperium's arrival as divine intervention by a supreme war deity. The iterators' attempts to promote the imperial truth's atheistic materialism often failed to completely erase these interpretations, particularly after the emperor's internment in the Golden Throne and the subsequent rise of the imperial cult legitimized religious worship of the master of mankind. Modern feral world populations frequently maintain traditions describing the emperor as the greatest warrior god who commands all tribes across the sky, with the Space Marines serving as his divine champions and Imperial Guard recruiters acting as his priests who select worthy warriors to join his eternal war. The ecclesiarchy finds these war god interpretations of the emperor theologically problematic, but pragmatically useful for maintaining imperial authority on feral worlds. Missionary teams cannot easily explain the emperor's true nature and the Imperium's complexity to populations that lack frameworks for understanding interstellar civilization or the scale of galactic conflict. Presenting the emperor as a supreme war god who demands tribute in the form of warriors makes immediate sense to tribal populations whose entire worldview centers on martial prowess and intergroup conflict. Recruitment becomes religiously mandated service to the greatest chief rather than abstract civic duty to a distant government, and populations that might resist secular authority accept recruitment quotas as sacred obligations they cannot refuse without inviting divine retribution. Gender roles on feral worlds typically reflect the harsh survival pressures that shape these societies, with divisions of labor based on physical capabilities and reproductive necessity rather than abstract cultural preferences. Most populations assign primary combat roles to males, while females focus on child rearing, food preparation, and craft production, though significant variations exist across different worlds and cultures. The biological reality that females must bear and nurse children creates practical limitations on their participation in extended hunting expeditions or warfare campaigns that might last weeks away from settlements. Populations cannot afford to risk their reproductive capacity by exposing pregnant or nursing females to the dangers that warriors face regularly, as demographic collapse threatens any group that loses too many women of childbearing age. Some feral worlds develop cultures where females participate fully in warfare and hunting despite reproductive constraints. These populations typically emerge on worlds where environmental pressures create such severe survival challenges that groups cannot afford to exclude half their potential warriors from combat roles. Tribes might maintain traditions where females fight until pregnancy, withdraw from combat during late pregnancy and early child rearing, then return to warrior status once children reach sufficient age for others to provide care. Other populations develop specialized female warrior roles, focusing on settlement defense rather than offensive operations, allowing women to protect communities while males conduct extended campaigns. The Space Wolves occasionally recruit from worlds with strong female warrior traditions, though the gene seed implantation process remains restricted to males regardless of source populations' cultural practices regarding gender and combat. Coming-of-age rituals serve as critical transition points in feral world societies, marking the passage from childhood to adult status and determining individuals' positions within tribal hierarchies. These ceremonies typically occur when young people reach physical maturity, usually between ages 12 and 16, depending on local standards and environmental factors affecting development rates. The specific requirements vary enormously across different populations, but most involve demonstrations of capabilities necessary for survival in the tribe's particular environment. Young warriors must prove they can hunt dangerous prey, endure physical hardship, or succeed in combat against peers or enemies. Females face different but equally demanding tests demonstrating skills in crafts, food preparation, or knowledge of medicinal plants and survival techniques essential for maintaining settlements. Trial by combat systems represent the most common form of coming-of-age ritual on feral worlds with strong warrior cultures. Young males must fight against peers, adult warriors, or dangerous animals to prove their worthiness for adult status. These combats range from relatively safe contests, where participants use blunted weapons and fight, until first blood to lethal encounters, where aspirants face genuine threats with full understanding that failure means death. The lethality of these trials correlates directly with how harsh the environment is, and how desperately the population needs to ensure only the strongest individuals achieve warrior status. Tribes living on death worlds where marginal survival requires exceptional physical capabilities typically maintain brutal coming-of-age trials that kill significant percentages of participants, while populations facing less extreme conditions can afford gentler tests that emphasize skill demonstration rather than pure survival. Space Marine chapters exploit these coming-of-age systems as natural selection mechanisms for identifying potential aspirants. Recruitment teams monitor tribal populations during ritual periods when young warriors undergo their trials, observing thousands of candidates simultaneously as they demonstrate the physical capabilities and psychological characteristics that might indicate suitability for transformation into Astartes. The trials eliminate unsuitable candidates before chapters expend any resources on testing or training, as individuals who fail to survive their own culture's coming-of-age requirements obviously lack the basic resilience necessary for gene seed implantation. Successful trial participants have already proven they possess courage, pain tolerance, and combat instinct, making them superior candidates compared to untested populations from civilized worlds where young people might never face genuine physical danger before recruitment. The Administratum recognizes that feral world coming-of-age rituals provide more effective screening than any imperial testing protocol could achieve. Tribes that have maintained these traditions across thousands of years have refined their selection processes through trial and error, eliminating practices that fail to identify capable warriors and preserving methods that consistently produce survivors suited to their environments. Imperial recruitment teams simply harvest the products of this cultural evolution rather than attempting to impose external selection criteria that might prove less effective than traditions developed through generations of practical experience. The Adeptus Munitorum instructs recruitment officers to respect local coming-of-age practices even when they appear unnecessarily brutal by civilized standards, understanding that populations maintaining harsh trials do so because their survival requires warriors meeting those exact standards. The strategic value of feral world populations for Space Marine recruitment stems from characteristics that civilized societies rarely produce through natural selection. Young warriors raised on worlds where survival demands constant vigilance develop threat assessment capabilities that exceed anything training can instill. A child who grows up knowing that momentary inattention might result in death from predator attack or enemy raid learns situational awareness at an instinctive level that becomes neurologically hardwired before adolescence. These survival instincts prove invaluable during the transformation into Astartes, as aspirants must endure procedures that would break individuals lacking the psychological resilience forged through years of genuine danger. Recruits from hive worlds might possess physical strength from labor or under hive gang warfare, but they typically lack the constant environmental threat assessment that feral world populations develop from childhood. Physical hardiness represents another critical advantage that feral world recruits bring to Space Marine chapters. Bodies developed through years of hunting megafauna, enduring seasonal extremes, or simply surviving on marginal nutrition possess baseline capabilities that civilized populations cannot match. The gene seed implantation process places catastrophic stress on recipient physiology, requiring candidates with exceptional cardiovascular efficiency, bone density, and pain tolerance. Feral world warriors arrive at recruitment already possessing these characteristics through environmental adaptation rather than artificial conditioning. Their bodies understand how to function through injury and exhaustion because survival on their homeworlds demanded exactly those capabilities. Apothecaries conducting implantation procedures observe that feral world aspirants typically demonstrate higher success rates during the initial organ implantations compared to recruits from more comfortable environments, as their physiology has already been stress-tested by years of genuine hardship. The psychological resilience of feral world populations manifests in their relationship with violence and death. Warriors from tribal societies accept mortality as an immediate reality rather than abstract possibility. They have watched friends and family members die from injury, disease, or violence since childhood, creating psychological frameworks that process death as natural rather than traumatic. This familiarity with mortality proves essential for Space Marines, who must function in combat environments where brothers die regularly and hesitation born from fear of death leads to mission failure. Feral world recruits arrive already understanding that courage means acting despite fear rather than feeling no fear, a lesson that civilized recruits often struggle to internalize during training. Tribal warriors who have participated in blood feuds or defended settlements against raiders possess genuine combat experience before recruitment, eliminating the psychological shock that untested candidates face when first exposed to lethal violence. Cultural compatibility between feral world tribal structures and Space Marine chapter organization creates natural alignment that eases the transition from aspirant to battle brother. Tribal societies operate through hierarchies based on demonstrated prowess and personal loyalty to leaders who have proven their capability through action rather than inherited authority. Space Marine chapters function according to remarkably similar principles, where respect flows to warriors who achieve success in battle and leadership positions, go to those who demonstrate tactical brilliance and combat effectiveness. A feral world warrior accustomed to following a chief who earned his position by killing the previous leader or proving superior hunting skills understands immediately why he should obey a Space Marine sergeant who has survived centuries of warfare. The concept of warrior lodges within chapters mirrors tribal organization so closely that many feral world recruits experience less cultural disruption joining a Space Marine chapter than civilized recruits face when leaving their structured societies. Fenris serves as the archetypal example of successful Space Marine recruitment from a feral world environment, though the planet's unique characteristics create challenges that complicate direct comparison with other recruitment worlds. The Space Wolves draw their aspirants exclusively from Fenrisian tribes scattered across the Death World's hostile continents and archipelagos. These tribes war constantly among themselves and against the enormous predators that dominate Fenris's ecosystem, creating populations where only the strongest and most cunning individuals survive to adulthood. The Space Wolves maintain minimal direct contact with Fenrisian tribes except during recruitment periods, allowing the population to develop naturally according to their harsh environment, rather than imposing imperial cultural standards that might dilute the characteristics the chapter values. Fenrisian recruitment follows patterns established during the Great Crusade, when Leman Russ first organized his legion according to the traditions of his adopted homeworld. The Space Wolves do not actively select aspirants through formal testing procedures. Instead, they observe tribal warfare and hunting activities from concealed positions, identifying young warriors who demonstrate exceptional prowess during actual combat or dangerous hunts. When a warrior catches the attention of Space Wolves watchers through particularly impressive displays of courage or skill, the chapter arranges for that individual to face what Fenrisians call the trial of Morkai. Aspirants must survive alone in the wilderness during the killing cold of Fenrisian winter, traveling from their tribal territories to the Fang, the Space Wolves' fortress monastery that rises from the mountains of Asaheim. Most aspirants die during this journey, claimed by cold, predators, or simple exhaustion. Those who reach the Fang alive have proven they possess the baseline resilience necessary for gene seed implantation. The Space Wolves' gene seed carries unique complications that make Fenrisian recruitment particularly challenging even by Space Marine standards. The Canis helix embedded within the genetic legacy of Leman Russ creates physiological changes that go beyond standard Astartes transformation, introducing lupin characteristics that manifest differently in each recipient. Some space wolves develop enhanced senses of smell and hearing that exceed even typical Astartes capabilities. Others experience psychological changes that strengthen pack bonding instincts while simultaneously increasing aggressive tendencies. The most extreme cases undergo transformation into wolfen battle brothers who devolve into bestial states where human consciousness gives way to animalistic fury. Fenrisian populations demonstrate unusual compatibility with the Canis helix compared to recruits from other worlds, suggesting genetic factors in the Fenrisian population that facilitate successful integration of the space wolf's gene seed. Attempts to recruit from other worlds have produced lower success rates and higher incidence of wolfen transformation, reinforcing the chapter's reliance on their homeworld despite its limited population base. Chogoris provides a contrasting example of feral world recruitment where environmental conditions and cultural characteristics differ dramatically from Fenris while still producing exceptional space marine candidates. The White Scars draw aspirants from the nomadic tribes that roam Chogoris's vast steppes, populations that live entirely on horseback and define themselves through speed and mobility rather than static territorial defense. Chogorian tribes practice constant raiding warfare against each other, with young warriors proving themselves through successful raids that capture horses, supplies, or captives from rival groups. The White Scars value the tactical thinking and swift decision-making these raids require, as Chogorian warriors must plan attacks that achieve objectives quickly before enemies can organize effective responses or pursuit. Chogorian recruitment practices reflect the planet's nomadic culture and the White Scars' emphasis on individual initiative within coordinated operations. The chapter maintains representatives called Stormseer recruiters who travel with various tribes throughout the year, observing young warriors during raids and tribal gatherings. Unlike the Space Wolves' passive observation approach, White Scars recruiters interact directly with tribal populations, participating in hunts and sometimes joining raids to assess candidates under actual combat conditions. When recruiters identify promising warriors, they issue challenges that test not just physical capability, but also tactical creativity and willingness to attempt seemingly impossible tasks. A typical challenge might require an aspirant to steal a specific horse from a rival tribe's herd while that tribe remains on high alert, or to reach a distant location within an impossibly short timeframe. These challenges eliminate candidates who lack the combination of skill, cunning, and audacity that defines White Scars' combat doctrine. The White Scars' gene seed produces fewer physiological complications than the Space Wolves' Canis helix, but the chapter maintains equally strict standards regarding cultural compatibility. Chogorian recruits arrive already understanding the balance between individual excellence and collective coordination that characterizes White Scars' tactics. Tribal raiders must work together during attacks while simultaneously demonstrating personal prowess that earns status within their groups. This cultural foundation translates directly to White Scars' combat methodology, where individual squads operate with significant autonomy while maintaining awareness of overall strategic objectives. The chapter has occasionally recruited from other feral worlds with nomadic populations, but Chogorian candidates consistently demonstrate superior performance during training and transformation, suggesting that specific cultural factors beyond mere nomadism contribute to recruitment success. Several other chapters maintain recruitment rights to feral worlds that provide populations suited to their particular combat doctrines and cultural traditions. The Space Wolves' successor chapters, including the Wolf Brothers before their dissolution due to genetic instability, sought recruitment worlds resembling Fenris in environmental harshness and warrior culture. These chapters discovered that populations from high-gravity death worlds with megafauna predators produced aspirants who adapted most successfully to Space Wolves' gene seed derivatives, though none achieved the compatibility rates that pure Fenrisian recruitment provides. The genetic factors that make Fenrisians particularly suitable for Canis helix integration appear unique to that population, likely resulting from thousands of years of environmental adaptation to their specific world. The Raven Guard and their successors demonstrate different recruitment priorities when selecting feral world populations. These chapters value stealth, patience, and tactical flexibility over pure aggression, seeking populations whose survival strategies emphasize evasion and ambush rather than direct confrontation. Feral worlds where human populations occupy positions as prey species rather than apex predators produce warriors who instinctively understand the patience required for effective ambush tactics. Tribes that survive by avoiding megafauna predators rather than hunting them develop movement techniques and camouflage skills that translate well to Raven Guard combat doctrine. These populations learn from childhood that survival sometimes requires remaining motionless for hours while threats pass nearby, building the psychological capacity for extended observation and delayed action that characterizes Raven Guard operations. Selection trials conducted by Space Marine chapters on their recruitment worlds serve multiple functions beyond simple candidate assessment. These trials must identify individuals who possess not just physical capability, but also the psychological characteristics necessary for successful transformation and integration into chapter culture. The specific trial designs vary according to each chapter's priorities and the environmental conditions of their recruitment worlds. Trials on death worlds typically exploit existing environmental hazards, requiring aspirants to survive predetermined periods in particularly dangerous territories, or hunt specific prey animals that test combat skills and tactical thinking. Trials on post-apocalyptic feral worlds might involve navigating through ruined cities while avoiding radiation zones and hostile wildlife, assessing spatial awareness and threat evaluation capabilities. Cultural integration challenges begin immediately upon selection, as aspirants must rapidly adapt to technological environments that exceed anything their previous experience prepared them to understand. A tribal warrior who has never seen metal more sophisticated than a bronze knife must suddenly comprehend power armor, bolters, and void-capable spacecraft. The cognitive dissonance this creates would prove overwhelming without careful psychological management by chapter training cadres. Chapters employ various approaches to bridge this technological gap. Some maintain deliberate separation between aspirants and advanced technology during early training phases, introducing equipment gradually as candidates develop conceptual frameworks for understanding increasingly complex systems. Others employ full immersion approaches, surrounding aspirants with technology from day one and allowing them to develop understanding through direct experience rather than theoretical instruction. Literacy education represents one of the most significant challenges when integrating feral world recruits into Space Marine chapters. Most aspirants arrive completely illiterate, lacking not just reading and writing skills, but any concept that abstract symbols can represent spoken language. Chapter training cadres must teach basic literacy before aspirants can begin studying tactical doctrine, equipment maintenance procedures, or the historical records that preserve chapter traditions. This educational process typically occurs during the early stages of gene seed implantation, when aspirants spend extended periods recovering from surgical procedures. Apothecaries and chaplains use this recovery time to conduct intensive literacy instruction, recognizing that physical transformation means nothing if the resulting Space Marine cannot read tactical displays or comprehend written orders during combat operations. The hypno-indoctrination techniques that chapters employ during aspirant training prove particularly effective with feral world recruits despite their complete lack of technological familiarity. These techniques bypass conscious understanding, implanting knowledge directly into the subconscious mind through a combination of psycho-conditioning and carefully structured sleep learning protocols. An aspirant who has never seen a bolter can receive hypno-indoctrination containing complete weapon maintenance procedures, then wake with unconscious knowledge of how to field strip and reassemble the weapon despite having no conscious memory of learning these skills. This technology allows chapters to rapidly impart technical knowledge that would require years of conventional education, though the process carries risks of psychological damage if applied too aggressively or without proper preparation. Technological acclimatization extends beyond simple equipment operation to encompass fundamental shifts in how recruits conceptualize reality. Feral world warriors arrive with worldviews shaped by direct sensory experience and immediate cause and effect relationships. They understand that releasing a bowstring causes an arrow to fly because they can see and feel the mechanical process. Explaining that pressing a trigger causes a bolt round to fire through controlled explosive detonation and gyroscopic stabilization requires introducing concepts like chemistry and physics that have no equivalent in tribal knowledge systems. Chapter training cadres cannot simply present technical information and expect comprehension. They must first establish conceptual foundations that allow feral world recruits to understand how technology operates according to consistent principles rather than magic or divine intervention. The preservation of beneficial tribal warrior ethos during cultural integration requires careful balance between modernization and maintenance of characteristics that made feral world recruits valuable in the first place. Chapters recognize that completely erasing tribal identity would eliminate the psychological resilience and combat instincts they specifically sought by recruiting from feral worlds. Successful integration preserves core warrior values while redirecting their expression toward chapter objectives. A tribal warrior's loyalty to his clan becomes loyalty to his squad and chapter. His obligation to avenge fallen kin transforms into determination to honor fallen battle brothers through continued service. His understanding that survival requires constant vigilance translates directly to combat alertness that prevents ambushes and maintains operational security. Space Marine chapters employ various cultural practices that help feral world recruits maintain connections to their origins while adopting chapter identity. The Space Wolves explicitly preserve Fenrisian cultural elements within their chapter structure, maintaining feast hall traditions, oral storytelling customs, and even linguistic patterns drawn directly from tribal practices. This approach allows Fenrisian recruits to recognize their new lives as extensions of their tribal existence rather than complete breaks from everything they previously knew. Other chapters take different approaches, creating new traditions that incorporate elements from multiple recruitment worlds while establishing distinct chapter cultures that transcend any single population's practices. These synthetic traditions provide frameworks that allow recruits from diverse origins to unite under shared cultural identity while maintaining pride in their individual backgrounds. Comparative success rates between feral world recruits and those drawn from other population types reveal significant advantages that justify chapters' continued reliance on primitive populations despite the additional training challenges they present. Statistical analysis conducted by apothecaries across multiple chapters indicates that feral world aspirants survive gene seed implantation at rates approximately 15 to 20% higher than recruits from hive worlds and 10 to 15% higher than those from civilized worlds. These differences become more pronounced during the later stages of transformation, when aspirants receive organs like the osmodula that restructure skeletal systems, or the biscopia that dramatically increases muscle mass. The physical stress these implantations create proves more survivable for bodies already adapted to extreme environmental demands. Genetic compatibility factors contribute significantly to these success rate differentials. Populations on stable civilized worlds experience reduced selection pressure compared to feral world populations, where environmental hazards constantly eliminate individuals with suboptimal genetics. This ongoing natural selection on feral worlds produces populations with robust baseline genetics that accept gene seed implantation more readily than populations from protected environments where genetic weaknesses persist because they pose no survival disadvantage. Hive world populations demonstrate even greater genetic variability due to the enormous population sizes and reduced selection pressure in most hive environments. While hive worlds provide vast recruitment pools, the percentage of individuals within those populations who possess suitable genetics for space marine transformation remains lower than in feral world populations, where environmental pressures have already performed preliminary genetic screening. Psychological conditioning requirements differ substantially between feral world recruits and those from more developed societies, though not always in ways that favor feral world candidates. The psychological resilience and combat experience that feral world warriors possess reduces the conditioning necessary to prepare them for battlefield violence and the constant proximity to death that Space Marines experience. However, these same recruits require more extensive conditioning to function effectively in technological environments and comprehend the strategic scale of Imperial military operations. A Hive world recruit might struggle initially with combat stress, but adapts quickly to understanding void warfare tactics or coordinating with other Imperial forces through technological communication systems. Feral world recruits excel in direct combat situations, but sometimes struggle with abstract tactical concepts or operations, requiring extensive technological coordination. The training cadres responsible for transforming aspirants into battle brothers adjust their approaches based on recruitment world origins, recognizing that standardized training protocols prove less effective than tailored programs that address specific deficiencies while leveraging existing strengths. Feral world recruits receive accelerated combat training that builds on their existing fighting experience while focusing heavily on technological education and strategic thinking development. Hive world recruits undergo more intensive physical conditioning and combat stress inoculation while receiving less emphasis on basic technology instruction. Civilized world recruits typically require balanced programs that address moderate deficiencies across multiple areas rather than extreme weaknesses in specific domains. The Adeptus Munitorum classifies feral world regiments according to specialized combat roles that leverage the unique capabilities these populations develop through their primitive environments. Unlike Hive world regiments that typically field mass infantry formations or mechanized units, or civilized world regiments that might specialize in combined arms warfare, feral world regiments occupy tactical niches requiring skills that technological societies cannot easily replicate through training alone. Hunter-killer specialists form the most common regiment type drawn from death world populations, where warriors spend their entire lives tracking and eliminating dangerous prey. These soldiers arrive at Imperial service already possessing fieldcraft abilities that take years to develop in conventional troops, understanding instinctively how to read terrain for signs of enemy passage, identify optimal ambush positions, and move silently through hostile environments. Tracker units recruited from feral worlds demonstrate capabilities that approach those of specially trained scout companies from more developed regiments, but with the critical advantage that their skills emerge from cultural knowledge rather than military instruction. A tribal hunter who learned to follow game animals across varied terrain by observing his elders from childhood possesses tracking capabilities that become neurologically hardwired through years of practice. These warriors notice details that trained scouts might overlook because their survival depended on reading subtle environmental signs since before they could walk. Broken vegetation, disturbed soil, or scratches on rock surfaces that might escape notice by soldiers trained in urban or mechanized warfare environments register immediately to feral world trackers, whose ancestors refined these observation skills across thousands of generations. Cavalry formations represent another significant category of feral world military specialization, particularly from planets where populations maintain mounted warrior traditions similar to those found on Chogoris. These regiments employ indigenous animals as mounts rather than the mechanical vehicles or standardized imperial horses used by conventional cavalry units. The diversity of creatures pressed into cavalry service across different feral worlds reflects the enormous variety of megafauna that humans have domesticated or subjugated for military purposes. Some regiments ride massive reptilian beasts that can carry multiple warriors and function as mobile weapons platforms. Others employ swift avian creatures capable of limited flight that allows cavalry units to traverse terrain impassable to ground-based forces. The bond between riders and their mounts develops over years of close partnership, creating cavalry forces where individual warriors function as integrated units with their animals rather than simply soldiers who happen to ride. The tactical advantages these cavalry formations provide differ substantially from those offered by mechanized units despite superficial functional similarities. Biological mounts require no fuel supplies or mechanical maintenance, eliminating logistical vulnerabilities that plague vehicle-based cavalry. They navigate terrain using animal intelligence and instinct that allows them to traverse environments where mechanical systems would fail. Dense jungle that would immobilize wheeled or tracked vehicles poses minimal obstacle to creatures that evolve to move through such conditions. Swamps and marshes that would bog down conventional cavalry become navigable when riding creatures adapted to wetland environments. The Adeptus Munitorum values these capabilities for campaigns in environments where mechanical forces cannot operate effectively, deploying feral world cavalry to jungle death worlds, swamp planets, or any theater where terrain negates the advantages of conventional mechanized warfare. Savage close combat infantry formations drawn from feral worlds occupy a tactical category comparable to the famous Catachan jungle fighters, though each regiment reflects the specific environmental pressures and cultural traditions of its recruitment world. These units excel in melee combat through combination of physical capability and psychological conditioning that makes them exceptionally dangerous in close quarters engagements. Warriors who spent their youth fighting with primitive weapons against both human enemies and megafauna predators possess instinctive understanding of close combat dynamics that trained soldiers struggle to replicate. They read body language and movement patterns at subconscious levels, anticipating attacks and identifying vulnerabilities through pattern recognition developed across years of survival-dependent violence. The weapons these close combat specialists employ range from standard Imperial issue combat knives and bayonets to traditional tribal weapons that regiments maintain as cultural artifacts and practical combat tools. Some units carry axes or war clubs fashioned from materials native to their homeworlds, weapons that might appear primitive but prove devastatingly effective when wielded by warriors who trained with them since childhood. The Adeptus Munitorum initially attempted to standardize equipment across all Imperial Guard regiments, requiring feral world units to abandon traditional weapons in favor of standard issue gear. This policy proved counterproductive when commanders discovered that forcing feral world warriors to fight with unfamiliar weapons reduced their combat effectiveness rather than improving it. Current regulations allow regiments to maintain traditional melee weapons alongside standard Imperial equipment, recognizing that a warrior who has used the same axe pattern his entire life fights more effectively with that familiar tool than with an issued combat knife he received weeks before deployment. The Bronchian Longknives represent one of the few named feral world regiments that Imperial records document with sufficient detail to reconstruct their organizational structure and combat history. Recruited from Bront, a planet whose population lives in scattered tribal groups across temperate forests and grasslands, the Longknives earned their designation from the traditional long-bladed knives that Bronchian warriors carry as symbols of adult status and primary close combat weapons. These blades measure roughly 40 centimeters in length, forged from local iron ore using techniques preserved through oral tradition since before Imperial compliance. Bronchian warriors receive their long knives during coming-of-age ceremonies after proving themselves through traditional trials, and the weapons accompany them throughout their lives as both practical tools and cultural identifiers. The long knives combat doctrine emphasizes infiltration and close assault tactics that leverage their soldiers' fieldcraft abilities and melee prowess. Regiment commanders deploy their forces in extended skirmish lines rather than concentrated formations, allowing individual squads to operate with significant autonomy while maintaining overall coordination through officers who understand tribal warfare patterns. During planetary assault operations, Longknives units typically deploy ahead of main Imperial forces, infiltrating enemy positions to conduct reconnaissance and eliminate sentries before conventional units advance. Their ability to move silently through hostile terrain and kill enemies quietly using traditional blades rather than noisy lasguns makes them invaluable for operations requiring stealth and surprise. Combat records from campaigns where Longknives regiments served alongside conventional Imperial Guard units document their effectiveness in jungle and forest environments that stymie forces trained for open terrain warfare. During the Gehenna Prime compliance action in the 41st millennium, Longknives companies deployed into dense equatorial jungles that had defeated previous Imperial attempts at penetration. The thick vegetation and hostile wildlife created conditions where conventional infantry could barely maintain forward progress, while mechanized units found movement completely impossible. Longknives warriors, drawing on skills developed hunting in Bronze forests, navigated the jungle efficiently despite conditions that reduced other units to crawling advances measured in meters per hour. They established forward positions deep in enemy territory, providing intelligence about rebel force dispositions and conducting raids that disrupted enemy supply lines before conventional forces had even penetrated the jungle periphery. Numerous unnamed feral world regiments serve throughout the Imperium in specialized roles that rarely generate the detailed records that more prominent units accumulate. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains classification systems that identify regiments by recruitment world and general combat specialization rather than specific designations, particularly for units drawn from worlds that contribute relatively small recruitment pools. A typical entry might simply note Feral World Regiment, Death World Classification, Close Combat Specialization, followed by numerical identifiers and current deployment location. These anonymous regiments perform critical functions in campaigns across the galaxy, despite their lack of individual recognition, providing capabilities that more famous units cannot replicate. Death World campaign deployments consume the majority of Feral World Regiment assignments, as the Adeptus Munitorum recognizes that soldiers raised in primitive conditions adapt more readily to hostile planetary environments than troops from comfortable civilized worlds. When Imperial forces must conduct operations on jungle death worlds, toxic swamp planets, or radiation-scarred wastelands, commanders specifically request Feral World regiments whose soldiers possess inherent resistance to environmental hazards that would incapacitate conventional troops. Warriors who grew up drinking water that civilized populations would consider contaminated demonstrate immune systems that handle local pathogens more effectively than soldiers from sanitized hive environments. Troops accustomed to temperature extremes on their homeworlds function in hostile climates that would require extensive environmental protection equipment for standard Imperial Guard units. Integration challenges within the Astra Militarum structure begin immediately upon recruitment when tribal warriors encounter the technological and organizational complexity of Imperial military forces. The cultural shock that Feral World recruits experience exceeds anything soldiers from more developed worlds face, as they must simultaneously adapt to advanced technology, hierarchical military command structures, and the conceptual framework of interstellar warfare that their previous existence provided no preparation for understanding. A tribal warrior whose entire world consisted of his tribe's territory and perhaps knowledge of a few neighboring groups must suddenly comprehend that he now serves in military forces spanning thousands of worlds and conducting campaigns across galactic distances his mind struggles to conceptualize. Technological training requirements for Feral World recruits consume significantly more time and resources than equivalent training for soldiers from civilized or hive worlds. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains specialized training facilities on sector capital worlds, where newly recruited Feral World regiments undergo extended instruction periods before deployment to active war zones. These facilities house training cadres experienced in working with primitive populations, officers and senior non-commissioned personnel who understand the conceptual gaps that must be bridged before tribal warriors can function as effective Imperial Guard soldiers. Initial training focuses on basic technology familiarization, introducing recruits to concepts like electricity, mechanical systems, and electronic communication that form foundations for understanding military equipment. Lasgun operation training illustrates the challenges involved in technological acclimatization. A civilized world recruit might require a few hours of instruction to understand how lasguns function, how to maintain them, and how to employ them effectively in combat. That soldier arrives with conceptual frameworks for understanding directed energy weapons, having likely encountered similar technology in civilian contexts, even if never personally using such equipment. A feral world recruit possesses no such framework. The concept that pulling a trigger causes an invisible beam of light to emerge and strike targets at distance contradicts everything his experience with bows or thrown spears taught him about projectile weapons. Training cadres must first establish that light itself can function as a weapon, then explain how the lasgun's power pack generates and focuses that light into destructive beams. This instruction occurs through combination of demonstration and hands-on experience rather than theoretical explanation, as recruits lacking scientific education cannot comprehend technical descriptions of how laser weapons operate. Discipline issues emerge from fundamental cultural differences between tribal social structures and military hierarchical command systems. Feral world warriors arrive accustomed to following leaders who earn their positions through demonstrated prowess and maintain authority through continued success. They understand chains of command based on personal capability rather than abstract rank structures. When a tribal chief orders warriors into battle, those warriors follow because they have witnessed that chief's combat skill and trust his tactical judgment. Imperial military hierarchy operates differently, requiring soldiers to obey officers based on rank insignia rather than personal knowledge of those officers' capabilities. This system conflicts with tribal instincts, particularly when officers come from different cultural backgrounds or lack combat experience that feral world soldiers would consider necessary for leadership positions. The Adeptus Munitorum addresses these discipline challenges through careful officer assignment policies that place commanders with proven combat records in charge of feral world regiments. Young officers fresh from Schola Progenium academies rarely receive assignments to these units, as their theoretical military education and lack of battlefield experience fails to earn respect from warriors who judge leaders through practical demonstration. Instead, feral world regiments typically receive officers who earn their commissions through battlefield promotions or who come from military families with generations of service. These officers understand that commanding feral world troops requires leading from the front and demonstrating personal courage that matches or exceeds that of the soldiers under their command. Officers who attempt to direct feral world units from rear positions while avoiding personal risk quickly lose their soldiers' respect and face potential fragging incidents where disgruntled troops eliminate commanders they consider unworthy. Non-commissioned officer corps in feral world regiments frequently consist of soldiers promoted from within the regiment's ranks rather than transfers from other units. The Adeptus Munitorum discovered early in its experience with these formations that sergeants and corporals drawn from the same tribal populations as their soldiers commanded more effectively than NCOs transferred from conventional regiments. Tribal warriors respond better to leaders who share their cultural background and understand their perspective, even if those leaders possess less formal military training than career NCOs from civilized worlds. A sergeant who grew up in the same tribal confederation as his squad, who speaks their dialect and understands their customs, can maintain discipline and coordinate combat actions more effectively than a more experienced NCO from a hive world who the soldiers view as a foreign authority figure. Superstition management represents an ongoing challenge for officers commanding feral world regiments, as soldiers raised in cultures dominated by shamanistic traditions and supernatural belief systems interpret military situations through frameworks that can conflict with tactical reality. Warriors who believe that certain actions anger spirits or violate sacred taboos may refuse orders that contradict their religious convictions, creating discipline problems that conventional punishment cannot resolve. Executing a soldier for refusing orders based on sincere religious belief simply makes him a martyr to his comrades and increases the likelihood that others will follow his example. Officers must instead work within existing belief structures, finding ways to frame necessary military actions as compatible with tribal religious practices, or employing regimental chaplains to provide theological justifications that allow soldiers to follow orders without violating their spiritual obligations. Communication barriers extend beyond simple language differences to encompass fundamental conceptual gaps that complicate coordination between Feral World units and other Imperial forces. Most Feral World recruits arrive speaking only their tribal languages, possessing no knowledge of Low Gothic or any other Imperial lingua franca. The Adeptus Munitorum requires all Imperial Guard soldiers to achieve basic Low Gothic competency, but this language training proceeds slowly with populations that often lack literacy in their native tongues. Recruits must simultaneously learn to speak, read, and write in an unfamiliar language while also adapting to military life and technological training. The cognitive load this creates would overwhelm individuals from less resilient populations, and even Feral World warriors require months or years to achieve functional Low Gothic proficiency. Regiment commanders address communication challenges through various practical solutions that allow Feral World units to function effectively despite language barriers. Many regiments maintain translator specialists drawn from tribal populations who achieved superior Low Gothic skills and serve as intermediaries between officers and common soldiers. These translators accompany officers during operations, converting orders from Low Gothic into tribal languages and relaying soldier reports back to command elements. Some regiments develop simplified tactical vocabularies using basic Low Gothic terms combined with hand signals and visual markers that allow coordination without requiring full language proficiency. This approach proves particularly effective for units specializing in operations where verbal communication might compromise stealth, as Feral World warriors already possess cultural traditions of silent communication through gestures and signs developed for hunting. Combat specializations that leverage Feral World skills allow these regiments to achieve battlefield effectiveness that compensates for their technological and organizational limitations. Ambush warfare represents the primary tactical doctrine for most Feral World units, building directly on hunting traditions, where warriors learn to approach prey undetected and strike from concealment. Regiment commanders deploy these forces in roles requiring patience and fieldcraft that conventional troops struggle to provide. Feral World squads establish observation positions overlooking enemy supply routes or communication lines, remaining concealed for days or weeks while monitoring enemy movements and waiting for optimal moments to strike. Their ability to survive in hostile environments using minimal supplies and their comfort with extended periods of motionless waiting make them ideal for long-duration reconnaissance and interdiction missions. The ambush tactics Feral World regiments employ reflect tribal hunting methods adapted to military contexts. Warriors position themselves along likely enemy approach routes, using terrain features and natural camouflage to achieve complete concealment. They allow enemy forces to enter kill zones before initiating attacks, maximizing casualties during the critical first moments when surprised enemies cannot effectively respond. Traditional weapons prove particularly effective during these ambushes, as warriors wielding axes or long knives can kill enemies silently without the distinctive sound of lasgun fire that might alert nearby enemy forces. After achieving initial success, Feral World units typically withdraw rapidly rather than holding positions, using their superior knowledge of local terrain to evade enemy responses and establish new ambush positions elsewhere. Survival expertise that Feral World soldiers possess as cultural inheritance rather than trained skill allows their regiments to operate in environments and conditions that would render conventional forces combat ineffective. When supply lines fail or logistical support breaks down, situations that might force civilized world regiments to withdraw or face starvation, feral world units continue functioning by foraging for local food sources and fabricating necessary equipment from available materials. Warriors who grew up hunting and gathering can identify edible plants and locate water sources that soldiers from hive or civilized worlds would never recognize. They construct shelter from natural materials, maintain body temperature in extreme conditions through techniques learned from childhood, and treat injuries using field-expedient methods when medical supplies run out. Xeno's creature-handling capabilities emerge naturally in feral world regiments recruited from death worlds, where populations learn to coexist with or exploit dangerous alien organisms. Warriors from these backgrounds possess instinctive understanding of predator, behavior patterns, and threat assessment that allows them to operate in environments hosting hostile Xenos fauna that would devastate conventional forces. During campaigns on worlds infested with cataclysm devils, amble populations, or other dangerous non-sentient Xeno species, feral world troops demonstrate ability to avoid, evade, or when necessary eliminate these creatures using tactics developed through lifetimes of dealing with similar threats on their homeworlds. Some regiments actively exploit local fauna during combat operations, using knowledge of creature behavior to drive dangerous organisms toward enemy positions, or establish defensive perimeters in areas where Xeno's predators naturally discourage enemy approach. Fearless melee engagement represents perhaps the most valuable combat specialization that feral world regiments provide to Imperial military operations. Warriors raised in cultures where close combat with deadly opponents formed regular occurrence possess psychological conditioning that eliminates the hesitation civilized soldiers experience when facing melee combat. They charge into close quarters, fighting without the fear response that causes conventional troops to falter, their bodies and minds operating according to patterns established through years of survival-dependent violence. This fearlessness proves particularly valuable during urban warfare operations, where combat frequently devolves into room-to-room fighting, or during boarding actions in void warfare, where confined spaces force close engagement regardless of tactical preferences. The reputation feral world regiments earn through their combat performance creates complicated relationships with other Imperial Guard units deployed alongside them. Conventional regiments often view feral world soldiers with mixture of respect for their combat capabilities and discomfort with their primitive customs and savage approach to warfare. Officers from civilized world regiments sometimes request that feral world units operate independently rather than integrating them into combined operations, preferring to avoid the coordination challenges and cultural friction that close cooperation creates. Other commanders specifically seek feral world attachments for operations where their specialized skills prove essential, accepting the management difficulties as necessary costs for accessing capabilities that no other troop types can provide. The isolation that defines feral worlds creates conditions where populations remain vulnerable to corrupting influences that more connected Imperial worlds might detect and resist before contamination spreads beyond containable levels. Chaos corruption manifests insidiously on planets where tribal shamans practice spiritual traditions that blur the boundary between benign ancestor veneration and genuine warp entity contact. A shaman entering trance states to commune with what he believes are tribal spirits might unknowingly open his consciousness to demonic whispers, receiving visions that seem to offer wisdom or power while actually channeling the influence of the ruinous powers. The gradual nature of this corruption allows it to spread through entire populations before anyone recognizes what has occurred, as practices that began as harmless spiritual exercises transform incrementally into genuine chaos worship across generations. Gladiatorial traditions present particularly dangerous vectors for Khorne's influence on feral worlds, where warrior cultures emphasize ritual combat and blood sport as methods for resolving disputes or proving martial worth. Tribes that practice trial by combat or maintain traditions of ceremonial dueling to determine leadership create cultural frameworks that resonate with the blood god's nature. When shamanic leaders begin receiving visions encouraging more frequent combat, more lethal contests, or ritual practices involving blood offerings to honor fallen warriors. Populations often embrace these changes as natural evolutions of existing traditions rather than recognizing them as external corruption. The escalation occurs gradually enough that each generation views their practices as only slightly more extreme than their parents, never realizing that their great-grandparents would have considered their current rituals abhorrent violations of proper conduct. Historical records document numerous feral worlds that descended into complete cornate worship through exactly these patterns. The planet Gorgath Prime maintained gladiatorial traditions for millennia after imperial compliance, with tribal confederations gathering annually for great tournaments where warriors competed in non-lethal contests using blunted weapons. Administratum monitoring stations noted no concerning developments during the first 5 centuries following compliance. By the 38th millennium, however, observers reported that tournaments had evolved to allow lethal outcomes in specific circumstances when combatants agreed to death matches. Within another 2 centuries, all contests had become fights to the death, and shamanic leaders taught that the spirits of slain warriors required blood sacrifice to find peace in the afterlife. By the time inquisitorial investigation teams arrived in response to concerning reports, the entire planetary population participated in elaborate cornate worship, their gladiatorial traditions having transformed into demonic summoning rituals disguised as honorable combat. The Inquisition authorized exterminatus, as the corruption had penetrated too deeply for any hope of redemption. Nurgle's influence spreads through different mechanisms on feral worlds, where populations practice plague spirit veneration or develop religious traditions around disease and decay. Tribes living in environments where endemic diseases claim significant portions of their populations sometimes develop belief systems that personify illnesses as spiritual entities requiring appeasement. A population suffering regular outbreaks of jungle fever might begin making offerings to the fever spirit, hoping to earn its mercy through proper devotion. Shamans who claim ability to communicate with disease spirits and negotiate for their tribe's protection gain significant status, creating incentives for spiritual leaders to emphasize and elaborate these practices. When actual warp entities respond to this veneration, populations interpret the contact as confirmation that their beliefs are correct, rather than recognizing they have attracted demonic attention. The transformation from plague spirit appeasement to Nurgle worship follows predictable patterns that Ordo Malleus investigators have documented across multiple worlds. Initial practices involve relatively benign offerings and prayers requesting protection from disease. Shamans begin reporting visions from plague spirits providing knowledge of herbal remedies or ritual practices that supposedly prevent illness. Some of these remedies actually work, as warp entities manipulate circumstances to ensure early successes that reinforce the shaman's authority and the population's faith in their practices. Gradually, the spirits demand more elaborate devotion. Tribes that initially made simple offerings of food or crafted items receive instructions to conduct ceremonies involving deliberate infection of volunteers who serve as vessels for the plague spirit's presence. Populations rationalize these escalations as necessary sacrifices to maintain the spirit's protection, not understanding that they are feeding Nurgle's power through their worship of disease and decay. The planet Mortwold exemplifies how Nurgle corruption can consume feral world populations through plague spirit traditions. Imperial records indicate the world maintained stable compliance for nearly a millennium, with monitoring stations reporting standard feral world characteristics, including shamanistic practices involving disease spirit appeasement. The population suffered from various endemic illnesses native to Mortwold's swamp environments, and their spiritual traditions focused heavily on negotiating with the entities they believed controlled these diseases. Administratum officials noted these practices, but classified them as benign superstition requiring no intervention. By the early 41st millennium, however, visiting Munitorum recruitment teams discovered that the entire population had descended into Nurgle worship. Tribes conducted elaborate ceremonies where members deliberately infected themselves with various diseases as acts of devotion, believing that accepting the Plague Father's gifts demonstrated proper faith. The recruitment teams withdrew immediately and requested inquisitorial investigation. The subsequent purge required deployment of 3 Imperial Guard regiments and resulted in complete population elimination, as every individual showed signs of advanced corruption beyond any possibility of redemption. Genestealer cult infiltration represents a different category of threat that exploits feral world tribal structures through mechanisms distinct from chaos corruption. The Tyrannid vanguard organisms that establish these cults possess intelligence and patience that allows them to integrate themselves into primitive societies with devastating effectiveness. A genestealer patriarch arriving on a feral world faces populations that lack any conceptual framework for understanding Xenos threats or the biological horror that the creature represents. Tribal warriors who might successfully hunt megafauna predators native to their world possess no defense against an organism specifically evolved to infiltrate and subvert human populations through biological and psychic manipulation. The initial infection typically occurs when a patriarch encounters isolated individuals away from their tribes, perhaps hunters tracking prey through remote territories or scouts exploring unfamiliar regions. The genestealer's hypnotic abilities overwhelm victims before they can mount effective resistance, and the infection process begins immediately. First-generation hybrids retain enough human appearance to return to their tribes without raising immediate suspicion, though they exhibit behavioral changes that tribal members might attribute to spiritual experiences or simple personality shifts. These hybrids spread the infection to others through reproduction, creating second- and third-generation hybrids, whose increasingly human appearance allows them to integrate more fully into tribal society, while maintaining absolute loyalty to the patriarch through psychic bonding that victims cannot resist or even consciously recognize. The integration of patriarchs into tribal leadership hierarchies occurs through exploitation of existing power structures and cultural practices. A genestealer possesses physical capabilities that exceed any human warrior, and feral world cultures that determine leadership through combat prowess create perfect opportunities for infected individuals to seize authority. A hybrid warrior challenges the tribal chief to ritual combat, defeats him through the superhuman strength inherited from Xenos genetics, and claims leadership according to traditional succession practices. The tribe accepts this transition as normal, having no reason to suspect that their new leader serves an alien organism rather than representing a legitimately superior warrior. The patriarch itself typically remains hidden during early infiltration phases, directing operations through psychic control of infected individuals, while avoiding direct contact with uninfected humans who might recognize it as non-human. Warrior initiation rites provide particularly effective vectors for spreading genestealer infection throughout tribal populations. Many feral world cultures require young warriors to undergo trials involving isolation in wilderness areas, vision quests, or combat against dangerous creatures. These practices create situations where initiates separate from their tribes and become vulnerable to patriarch contact without witnesses who might raise alarms. Infected shamanic leaders manipulate initiation traditions to ensure young warriors encounter the patriarch during their trials, framing the infection as a spiritual blessing or divine transformation that marks them as chosen warriors. The initiates return from their trials believing they received favor from tribal spirits, unaware that the psychic compulsions they now experience originate from Xenos control rather than supernatural sources. The corruption of entire tribal populations can occur within just a few generations once genestealer infiltration begins. First-generation hybrids reproduce with uninfected humans, creating second-generation offspring who appear almost entirely human aside from minor physical abnormalities that tribal populations might dismiss as normal variation. These second-generation hybrids achieve positions throughout tribal society, their human appearance allowing them to avoid suspicion, while their absolute loyalty to the cult ensures coordinated action toward preparing the population for eventual tyrannid arrival. Third and fourth generation hybrids appear completely human and often rise to positions of significant authority, their intelligence and capabilities enhanced by Xenos genetics, while their appearance raises no concerns among uninfected tribal members. The psychic signal that mature genestealer cults broadcast into space eventually attracts Tyrannid hive fleets, at which point the cult's purpose becomes horrifyingly clear to any Imperial observers who discover the infiltration before the Xenos arrive. Infected populations believe they await the arrival of savior gods who will reward their faithful service, not understanding that the hive fleet will simply consume them along with all other biomass on their world. Feral world populations prove particularly vulnerable to this deception because their limited understanding of the galaxy prevents them from recognizing the true nature of the threat. Warriors who spent their lives hunting local predators cannot comprehend organisms that travel between stars to devour entire worlds, and their cultural frameworks provide no basis for understanding what tyrannids represent. Imperial detection of genestealer infiltration on feral worlds typically occurs far too late for effective intervention. Monitoring stations maintain minimal staff and conduct infrequent direct contact with tribal populations, creating gaps in surveillance that allow cults to spread undetected for decades. When recruitment teams arrive to collect tithes and discover that entire tribal confederations have disappeared or that populations exhibit strange behavioral changes, investigation often reveals that infection has already consumed most of the world's human inhabitants. The Ordo Xenos maintains strict protocols for responding to confirmed genestealer presence, typically authorizing immediate exterminatus rather than attempting to purge infected populations. The psychic control that patriarchs exert over their cults makes redemption impossible, and the risk that even a single infected individual might escape to spread contamination to other worlds outweighs any value the feral world population might have provided through recruitment. Orc invasions affect feral worlds differently than more developed Imperial planets, as the primitive human populations sometimes respond to greenskin presence in ways that create long-term complications extending beyond the immediate threat of Xenos conquest. When orc warbands descend upon feral worlds, they encounter human populations operating at technological levels not vastly different from the crudest orc equipment. Tribal warriors fighting with stone weapons and basic metallurgy face greenskins wielding choppas and shootas that, while ramshackle by Imperial standards, represent overwhelming technological superiority compared to indigenous armaments. The resulting conflicts often end with human populations suffering catastrophic defeats, their warriors unable to effectively resist orc aggression despite their combat experience and physical capabilities. Some feral world populations respond to orc invasion through adoption of greenskin warfare patterns, a phenomenon that Ordo Xeno xenobiologists find deeply disturbing due to implications about orc cultural influence and the malleability of human societies under extreme pressure. Tribes that survive initial orc contact sometimes begin imitating greenskin tactics and organizational methods, perhaps recognizing that the Xenos' approach to warfare proved more effective than their traditional practices. Warriors start painting themselves green, adopting orcish war cries, and organizing into mobs rather than traditional tribal structures. These populations develop hybrid cultures that blend human and orcide elements in ways that create abominations requiring immediate imperial purging. The psychological mechanisms driving this cultural adoption remain poorly understood, though inquisitorial scholars have proposed several theories. Some suggest that the orc gestalt psychic field exerts subtle influence on nearby human populations, creating subconscious compulsions to imitate greenskin behavior. Others argue that humans desperate for survival strategies that work against orc aggression simply copy what they observe to be effective, with no supernatural influence required. Regardless of the underlying cause, the result creates populations that imperial authorities cannot tolerate. Humans who have adopted orc cultural practices demonstrate loyalty patterns and behavioral characteristics incompatible with imperial service. and the risk that this cultural contamination might spread to other populations through contact or recruitment makes these hybrid cultures existential threats requiring elimination. The planet Gorka, discovered by explorator fleets in the Segmentum Ultima during the 40th millennium, provided the most extensively documented example of human-orc cultural hybridization. Initial surveys detected human populations alongside substantial orc presence, an unusual situation that warranted closer investigation. Landing parties discovered that the human tribes had lived alongside orcs for centuries, following an ancient invasion that destroyed the world's original civilization. Rather than being exterminated or enslaved, the human survivors had integrated into orc society as subordinate participants in the greenskins' endless warfare. Human warriors fought in orc mobs, painted themselves green, and spoke a pidgin language combining low Gothic fragments with orcish vocabulary. They worshipped Gork and Mork alongside their orc companions and had completely abandoned any recognizable human cultural practices. The explorator fleet requested immediate military intervention, and the Astra Militarum deployed sufficient forces to conduct complete planetary purge, eliminating both the orc populations and their human collaborators without distinction. Dark Eldar raiding operations, targeting feral worlds follow patterns, optimized for harvesting primitive populations as slave stock for Comora's flesh markets. The Xenos raiders prefer feral world targets specifically because these populations cannot mount effective resistance against anti-gravity skimmers and directed energy weapons, allowing Drukhari raiding parties to capture large numbers of victims with minimal risk or effort. A typical raid begins with Dark Eldar forces emerging from webway portals in remote locations away from any Imperial monitoring stations, their approach completely undetectable to tribal populations that lack technological surveillance capabilities. The raiders employ speed and shock tactics, descending upon tribal settlements in swift attacks that overwhelm defenders before organized resistance can form. The weapons and equipment Dark Eldar raiders deploy against feral world populations create one-sided engagements that barely qualify as combat. Tribal warriors armed with spears or bows face enemies, wielding splinter weapons that cause agonizing deaths through crystallized toxin injection, or dark light weapons that disintegrate targets at molecular levels. The psychological impact of watching comrades dissolve into atoms or collapse screaming from neurotoxin effects breaks tribal morale almost immediately, as warriors accustomed to comprehensible threats like predator attacks or enemy arrows cannot process the reality of weapons that kill through mechanisms their worldview cannot accommodate. Dark Eldar raiders exploit this psychological advantage ruthlessly, using terror tactics to paralyze resistance and facilitate rapid capture of victims who might otherwise flee into wilderness areas where pursuit would prove time-consuming. The selection criteria Dark Eldar employ when choosing victims from feral world populations reflect the specific demands of Comora's slave markets. Young, physically capable individuals command premium prices, as they provide either extended service as laborers or entertainment value in gladiatorial arenas. Children face particularly high risk during raids, as they represent long-term investments for slave owners who can train them from youth to accept their bondage. The elderly and infirm hold minimal value and typically face immediate execution during raids, as transporting individuals unlikely to survive the journey to Comora wastes cargo capacity better used for more profitable captives. Dark Eldar raiders conduct these selections with clinical efficiency, separating tribal populations into viable slaves and worthless surplus within minutes of securing settlements. The cultural trauma that Dark Eldar raids inflict upon surviving feral world populations extends far beyond the immediate loss of captured individuals. Tribes that experience these attacks develop collective psychological damage that manifests in ways that can persist across multiple generations. Warriors who witnessed their companions disintegrate or watched helplessly as raiders carried away their families often suffer complete psychological breaks, becoming unable to function as effective tribal members. Some survivors develop elaborate superstitions around the raids, interpreting the Dark Eldar as demons or evil spirits and creating ritual practices meant to ward against future attacks. These practices rarely provide any actual protection, but serve psychological functions by giving populations illusion of control over threats they cannot truly resist or predict. The unpredictability of Dark Eldar raiding patterns prevents feral world populations from developing effective defensive strategies. Unlike orc invasions that might target specific regions or follow comprehensible strategic logic, Drukhari raids occur seemingly at random, striking any settlement that raiders consider convenient targets during their expeditions through the webway. A tribe might experience a raid, then endure decades without further contact before suffering another attack. This irregular pattern prevents populations from maintaining constant defensive readiness, as the economic and social costs of permanent high alert status prove unsustainable for communities that must focus primarily on basic survival through hunting and gathering. When raids do occur, they typically achieve complete surprise regardless of any precautions tribes attempt to implement. The Administratum's ability to protect feral world populations from Dark Eldar raids remains severely limited by the logistical realities of monitoring thousands of primitive planets scattered across the Imperium. Monitoring stations lack the military resources to repel Drukhari attacks, and their communication equipment cannot summon reinforcements quickly enough to intercept raiders who complete their operations and withdraw through webway portals within hours. Even if Imperial Navy vessels could respond to distress calls in time, the Dark Eldar's mobility advantage and knowledge of webway access points scattered across feral worlds makes interception nearly impossible. Naval commanders cannot predict where raids will occur or maintain sufficient forces in position to defend every vulnerable tribal settlement across an entire planet's surface. Some feral worlds suffer repeated Dark Eldar attention across centuries, becoming regular hunting grounds where Drukhari raiding parties return periodically to harvest fresh slaves from populations that have recovered from previous attacks. These worlds develop reputations within Camorra as reliable sources for hardy slave stock, and multiple cabals might compete for raiding rights to particularly productive territories. The human populations on these worlds live under constant threat, their cultures shaped by the knowledge that at any time, the sky demons might return to steal away their loved ones. Some tribes abandon permanent settlements entirely, adopting nomadic lifestyles that make them harder targets for raiders seeking concentrated victim populations. Others retreat to caves or underground shelters where they hide during vulnerable periods, emerging only when necessary to hunt or gather food. The long-term demographic impact of sustained Dark Eldar raiding can reduce feral world populations below viable thresholds for Imperial recruitment, eliminating whatever value these worlds provided to the Administratum. When raiding frequency reaches levels where population growth cannot compensate for losses to slave taking, tribal societies enter death spirals where each generation produces fewer children than the previous one. Eventually, these populations face extinction through demographic collapse rather than direct military defeat. The Administratum typically responds to this situation by downgrading affected worlds from active recruitment status to monitoring-only classification, accepting that the populations no longer provide sufficient yields to justify continued investment in maintaining Imperial presence. Some worlds receive complete abandonment, with monitoring stations withdrawn and the remaining human populations left to their fate without any Imperial protection or oversight. The interaction between multiple threat categories creates compound vulnerabilities that prove especially dangerous for feral world populations. A planet weakened by Dark Eldar raids becomes more susceptible to genestealer infiltration, as traumatized populations prove more receptive to cult promises of protection from sky demons. Tribes suffering from endemic diseases that Nurgle-influenced shamans claim to control become easier targets for Dark Eldar raids, as populations weakened by illness mount less effective resistance. Orc invasions that disrupt tribal territories create chaos that genestealer patriarchs exploit to spread infection, while populations focus on immediate greenskin threats. The Administratum's monitoring systems struggle to track these compounding vulnerabilities, as limited observation capabilities prevent officials from recognizing how multiple threats interact to create situations far more dangerous than any single threat category would suggest. The Administratum's approach to governing feral worlds operates under fundamentally different parameters than those applied to civilized or hive worlds, recognizing that populations living at Stone Age technological levels cannot provide the material tithes that form the foundation of imperial taxation systems elsewhere. A hive world might owe billions of rounds of munitions annually, vast quantities of manufactured goods, or regiments of mechanized infantry equipped from planetary factories. A civilized world contributes agricultural products, mineral resources, or specialized equipment according to its particular industrial capabilities. Feral worlds possess none of these capacities. Their populations produce no surplus beyond immediate subsistence needs, manufacture no goods suitable for interstellar trade, and maintain no infrastructure that could support conventional imperial taxation. The tithe assessment process for feral worlds, therefore, focuses almost exclusively on manpower recruitment, with Administratum officials calculating sustainable extraction rates based on demographic surveys conducted during periodic compliance reviews. These calculations require careful consideration of factors that would be irrelevant when assessing more developed worlds. Population growth rates on feral worlds fluctuate significantly based on environmental conditions, tribal warfare intensity, and disease patterns that monitoring stations struggle to track with precision. A world that could sustainably provide 500 recruits annually during favorable periods might produce only 200 during years when drought, predator migration disruptions, or epidemic illness stress tribal populations. The Administratum attempts to establish tithe quotas that account for these variations, setting baseline requirements low enough that worlds can meet them even during difficult periods, while authorizing additional recruitment during abundant years. The monitoring cycles between direct Administratum contact with feral world populations stretch across decades or even centuries, creating governance patterns that differ radically from the constant oversight applied to more strategically significant planets. A typical monitoring station operates with minimal staff, perhaps a dozen Administratum officials supported by a small Militarum garrison for security. These personnel conduct periodic surveys of tribal populations, traveling to major settlements or gathering sites to observe demographic conditions and assess whether current tithe levels remain sustainable. Between these active monitoring periods, the stations maintain passive observation through orbital auger arrays that track general population movements and detect major disruptions like xenos invasions or catastrophic environmental events. The actual human contact between imperial officials and tribal populations might occur only once every 50 years, with entire generations of tribespeople living and dying without ever encountering representatives of the Imperium they theoretically serve. This minimal contact approach reflects practical limitations rather than deliberate policy choices. The Administratum lacks the personnel to maintain active governance over millions of imperial worlds, and feral worlds rank among the lowest priorities for resource allocation. Officials assigned to monitoring stations typically view these postings as punishments or dead-end assignments, offering minimal opportunity for career advancement. The work involves years of isolation on primitive planets where nothing of significance occurs between infrequent recruitment cycles. Ambitious Administratum functionaries seek positions on forge worlds, hive worlds, or sector capitals where their activities might attract notice from superiors and lead to promotion. Those sent to feral world monitoring stations generally remain there until retirement or death, forgotten by the bureaucratic apparatus that assigned them. The recruitment process itself unfolds according to protocols designed to minimize disruption to tribal societies, while extracting the human resources the Imperium requires. When tithe collection periods arrive, Militarum officials coordinate with monitoring station personnel to identify optimal recruitment locations and timing. These decisions consider tribal gathering patterns, seasonal conditions, and current inter-tribal conflict situations that might affect recruitment success. Officials prefer conducting recruitment during periods when multiple tribes converge for trade, ceremonies, or seasonal hunts, as these gatherings provide access to large numbers of potential candidates without requiring officials to travel between scattered settlements. The timing also exploits tribal social dynamics, as young warriors attending these gatherings often seek opportunities to demonstrate prowess and earn status. Recruitment becomes another arena for competition, with tribal members viewing selection for imperial service as recognition of superior capability rather than unwelcome conscription. The selection criteria Militarum officials employ during recruitment emphasize physical capability and psychological characteristics that indicate suitability for military service. Officials observe tribal warriors during competitions, hunts, or combat demonstrations that gatherings naturally include, identifying individuals who display strength, coordination, aggression, and tactical thinking. The process resembles livestock selection more than conventional military recruitment, with officials literally pointing at individuals they deem acceptable and directing them to assembly areas for transport off-world. Tribal leaders typically cooperate with this process because resistance would invite military retaliation they cannot hope to resist, and because the recruitment system has operated for so long that it has become integrated into tribal cultures as an expected aspect of life. Some tribes view imperial selection as honor, believing that warriors chosen for service join the emperor's eternal war as his chosen champions. The material tithes that some feral worlds provide exist as exceptions rather than standard practice, occurring only when planets possess specific resources extractable without requiring advanced technology or infrastructure. Worlds with surface deposits of precious metals might owe small quantities of gold or silver that tribal populations can gather through simple placer mining or surface collection. Planets hosting unique biological organisms that possess medicinal or industrial applications sometimes face requirements to harvest and deliver these materials according to schedules that account for reproductive cycles and sustainable yield calculations. The quantities involved remain negligible compared to tithes from developed worlds. A feral world might provide a few hundred kilograms of rare herbs annually, while an agri-world ships millions of tons of food products during the same period. These token material tithes serve primarily to maintain the legal fiction that all imperial worlds contribute according to their capabilities, rather than reflecting any genuine economic value. The Adeptus Ministorum maintains parallel authority structures on compliant feral worlds through missionary ships that conduct irregular visits to reinforce basic imperial cult observance and prevent complete cultural drift into patterns incompatible with imperial ideology. These vessels, typically ancient transport craft repurposed for evangelical work, follow circuit routes that bring them to designated feral worlds on schedules measured in decades. A missionary ship might service 20 or 30 worlds scattered across a subsector, spending several months at each location before moving to the next stop on its endless rotation. The missionaries aboard these ships face the challenging task of maintaining religious orthodoxy among populations whose understanding of the Imperium remains limited to occasional encounters with recruitment teams and vague legends about the Emperor as supreme war god. The missionaries recognized that imposing sophisticated imperial cult theology on feral world populations would prove both impossible and counterproductive. Tribal peoples cannot comprehend concepts like the Emperor's sacrifice on the Golden Throne, the nature of the Astronomicon, or the theological distinctions between the Emperor as man and the Emperor as divine entity that occupy ecclesiarchy scholars on civilized worlds. Instead, missionaries focus on establishing basic religious frameworks that align tribal beliefs with acceptable imperial patterns, while eliminating practices that suggest chaos influence or Xenos corruption. They teach simplified versions of imperial doctrine that present the emperor as the greatest warrior who demands courage, strength, and loyalty from his followers. The saints become legendary heroes whose deeds provide moral instruction through stories that tribal oral traditions can preserve and transmit across generations. The integration of imperial religious observance with existing tribal spiritual practices requires careful negotiation and cultural manipulation. Missionaries cannot simply declare that traditional beliefs are false and demand immediate conversion to pure imperial cult worship. Such approaches would generate resistance that monitoring station garrisons lack the strength to overcome through force, and would likely drive populations toward more extreme religious positions rather than compliance. Instead, missionaries employ syncretistic methods that incorporate existing practices into imperial frameworks. Ancestor veneration becomes worship of the emperor's faithful servants who continue watching over their descendants from the emperor's side. Tribal spirits transform into aspects of the emperor's power, manifesting in natural phenomena. Seasonal ceremonies gain new significance as celebrations of imperial holy days that happen to coincide with traditional observances. The prevention of complete cultural drift into heresy represents the missionaries' primary objective, as populations left without regular imperial religious contact sometimes develop belief systems that cross boundaries into chaos worship without recognizing what they have done. The missionaries conduct assessments during their visits, observing tribal ceremonies and interviewing shamanic leaders to identify concerning developments in local religious practices. They look for specific markers that indicate potential corruption. Excessive emphasis on blood sacrifice beyond what survival necessity requires suggests possible Khorne influence. Rituals involving deliberate disease transmission or veneration of decay point toward Nurgle corruption. Practices encouraging extreme emotional states, whether rage, despair, or ecstatic pleasure, might indicate influence from other chaos powers. When missionaries identify these warning signs, they work to redirect tribal practices towards safer patterns, sometimes requiring forceful intervention if populations resist correction. The limited resources available to missionary ships constrain their effectiveness considerably. A vessel might carry only a dozen ordained priests supported by perhaps 50 lay brothers and a small armed contingent for protection. These personnel must address spiritual needs of entire planetary populations numbering in the millions, an obviously impossible task that forces missionaries to focus their efforts on tribal leadership and hope that changes at the top filter down through social hierarchies. Missionaries prioritize contact with paramount chiefs, influential shamans, and other individuals whose authority allows them to shape tribal religious practices. Converting or correcting these leaders theoretically influences the populations they govern, though the effectiveness of this top-down approach varies significantly depending on how much actual authority tribal leaders exercise over their followers' spiritual beliefs. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains separate interest in feral worlds driven by objectives completely distinct from either administratum governance or ministorum religious oversight. The tech priests view these primitive planets as potential repositories for lost standard template construct fragments and Dark Age technology that might survive in ruins beneath tribal settlements or in wilderness areas that populations avoid due to superstitious fear. The possibility that a feral world might host intact SDC data or functional archaeotech justifies significant Mechanicus investment in exploration and excavation operations, as even a single complete SDC fragment could provide technological advances worth more than centuries of conventional research and development. Explorator expeditions to feral worlds follow protocols established through millennia of experience recovering ancient technology from hostile environments. The Mechanicus deploys survey teams equipped with sophisticated detection equipment capable of identifying buried structures, power signatures from dormant machinery, or radiation patterns consistent with specific Dark Age technologies. These teams conduct systematic searches across planetary surfaces, paying particular attention to locations that tribal legends identify as cursed, haunted, or forbidden. The tech priests recognize that populations living among ancient ruins often develop superstitions around the most dangerous or significant sites, unconsciously preserving knowledge about archaeotech locations through cultural prohibitions against approaching certain territories. The interaction between Mechanicus expeditions and indigenous populations creates complications that require careful management to avoid disrupting tribal societies or violating administratum regulations governing feral world contact. The tech priests possess legal authority to conduct archaeological operations on any imperial world, but they must coordinate with local administratum officials and respect existing governance structures. When potential archaeotech sites lie within tribal territories or overlap with locations that populations consider sacred, the Mechanicus faces choices between negotiating access through tribal leaders or simply seizing what they want through force. The decision typically depends on how valuable the potential discovery appears and how much resistance the expedition expects to encounter. Cooperation between Mechanicus expeditions and tribal populations occurs more frequently than conflict, as the tech priests can offer inducements that primitive peoples find irresistible in exchange for access to archaeological sites. Simple technology that would be worthless to civilized populations represents miraculous treasure to tribes using stone tools. A Mechanicus expedition might trade a few dozen metal knives, some basic medical supplies, or a small solar-powered lamp in exchange for tribal guides who lead them to ancient ruins and provide labor for excavation work. The tribes benefit from acquiring tools superior to anything they could manufacture themselves, while the Mechanicus gains local knowledge and physical assistance that accelerates their archaeological operations. These transactions operate entirely outside official imperial economic systems, as the Mechanicus rarely bothers documenting trade arrangements with primitive populations it considers barely relevant to its actual interests. Conflict emerges when tribal populations refuse Mechanicus access to sites they consider spiritually significant, or when tech priests determine that negotiation would consume more time than forceful seizure. Some tribes maintain elaborate religious traditions around ancient ruins, believing them to be dwellings of gods or ancestors whose rest must not be disturbed. Warriors guard these sites against outsiders, prepared to fight and die rather than permit violation of sacred ground. The Mechanicus views these concerns as irrelevant superstition that cannot be allowed to obstruct legitimate archaeological research. Skitarii units accompanying explorator expeditions possess overwhelming military superiority compared to tribal warriors, and tech priests do not hesitate to employ lethal force when populations resist their operations. The resulting conflicts typically end quickly, with tribal defenders suffering catastrophic casualties before survivors flee or surrender. The archaeological discoveries that Mechanicus expeditions recover from feral worlds range from complete disappointments to finds of extraordinary significance. Many sites that appeared promising based on initial surveys yield only corroded wreckage too damaged for useful analysis or reconstruction. The millennia these ruins endured exposed to weather, geological activity, and simple entropy destroyed most technology beyond any hope of recovery. Even when expeditions locate intact structures or equipment, the absence of proper documentation or operational manuals limits the Mechanicus's ability to understand what they have found. A perfectly preserved Dark Age machine means nothing if the tech priests cannot determine its purpose or activation procedures. The Mechanicus has recovered countless artifacts whose functions remain complete mysteries despite centuries of study, devices that clearly represent sophisticated technology, but whose operation eludes all attempts at comprehension. Successful recoveries of functional SDC fragments or Dark Age technology from feral worlds occur rarely enough that each discovery generates significant attention within the Mechanicus hierarchy. A single intact SDC pattern for a useful device might revolutionize Imperial manufacturing capabilities across entire sectors. Dark Age weapons recovered in working condition could provide templates for new equipment that enhances Astra Militarum combat effectiveness. Even partial data recovery from damaged systems sometimes yields insights that advance Mechanicus' understanding of principles their own technology cannot replicate. These successes justify the enormous resources the Mechanicus invests in feral world archaeology, as the potential rewards from even occasional discoveries outweigh the costs of thousands of failed expeditions. The Inquisition maintains oversight protocols for feral worlds that focus primarily on detecting chaos corruption, monitoring mutation rates, and ensuring that tribal warrior traditions remain within acceptable parameters rather than crossing into genuine chaos worship. Inquisitors assigned to monitor these worlds operate under standing orders that define specific thresholds requiring intervention. Mutation rates exceeding 10% of observed populations trigger mandatory investigation to determine whether genetic damage results from natural environmental factors or warp influence. Tribal practices involving ritual murder, beyond what survival necessity or traditional warfare justifies, warrant scrutiny for possible corn corruption. Religious ceremonies that populations conduct in secret or that tribal members refuse to discuss with imperial officials raise suspicions about hidden chaos worship that requires immediate examination. The challenge Inquisitors face when monitoring feral worlds stems from the inherent difficulty of distinguishing acceptable warrior traditions from early-stage chaos corruption. Many tribal cultures practice behaviors that would constitute heresy on civilized worlds, but which represent normal cultural patterns for primitive populations. Ritual scarification, trophy taking from slain enemies, and elaborate warrior initiations involving physical ordeal all appear in tribal societies across thousands of feral worlds without indicating any chaos influence. Inquisitors must evaluate these practices within their cultural contexts, determining whether they serve legitimate social functions or whether they have begun transforming into something darker. A tribe that takes enemy skulls as battle trophies might simply be following ancient tradition, or they might be unconsciously serving corn through practices that feed the blood god's nature even if the warriors lack any awareness of chaos. The mutation monitoring that Inquisitors conduct on feral worlds requires careful baseline establishment to distinguish between genetic damage from natural environmental causes and corruption from warp exposure. Many feral worlds host populations with elevated mutation rates compared to civilized world standards due to radiation exposure, chemical contamination from ancient industrial disasters, or simply genetic drift in isolated populations. These mutations typically manifest as minor physical variations that do not indicate chaos taint. Unusual hair or eye colors, slight differences in bone structure, or enhanced resistance to specific environmental toxins all fall within acceptable parameters. Mutations suggesting warp influence present differently, often involving symmetrical changes affecting multiple body systems, growths or alterations that serve no adaptive purpose, or psychological changes accompanying physical transformation. Inquisitors maintain detailed documentation of mutation patterns across different feral worlds, building databases that help distinguish natural genetic variation from corruption requiring purge actions. The thin line between acceptable warrior tradition and chaos worship proves most difficult to assess when evaluating tribal religious practices that emphasize martial prowess and glorification of violence. The Imperium itself maintains a civilization built on constant warfare, and imperial ideology celebrates military service as humanity's highest calling. Tribal cultures that develop similar value systems theoretically align with imperial principles, yet the same cultural patterns that produce excellent Imperial Guard recruits can also create populations vulnerable to corn corruption. Inquisitors evaluating these situations must determine whether tribal emphasis on combat and bloodshed remains within bounds of acceptable martial culture, or whether it has crossed into territory where violence becomes an end in itself rather than a means of survival or defense. This assessment requires intimate knowledge of tribal practices and their historical development, information that monitoring stations often cannot provide with sufficient detail for confident judgment. The inquisitorial response to confirmed chaos corruption on feral worlds follows established protocols that prioritize containment and elimination over redemption. Unlike civilized worlds, where populations might receive opportunities for repentance and re-education, feral world populations showing chaos taint typically face immediate exterminatus authorization. The Inquisition recognizes that primitive populations lack the conceptual frameworks necessary to understand why their practices constitute heresy or what alternatives exist. A tribal warrior who has worshipped what he believes are ancestral spirits his entire life cannot simply abandon those beliefs when informed they actually represent demonic entities. The psychological and cultural foundations that would allow genuine conversion do not exist, making purge actions the only reliable solution. The relatively low strategic value of feral world populations compared to more developed planets makes this calculus easier, as the Imperium loses little by destroying worlds that contributed only modest recruitment yields, while eliminating threats that might otherwise spread to more valuable territories. Fenris stands as perhaps the most significant feral world in Imperial history, serving as both recruitment ground and home world for the Space Wolves chapter. The planet's extreme axial tilt creates seasonal variations so dramatic that they reshape the world's geography on cyclical patterns spanning Terran years. During the brief Fenrisian summer, the planet's ice caps retreat and vast continental landmasses emerge from beneath glacial coverage, their surfaces supporting ecosystems where megafauna populations flourish in the temporary warmth. The tribes that inhabit these lands build their settlements, hunt the great beasts that roam the thawing territories, and wage their wars during these months of relative plenty. As winter approaches and temperatures plummet, the ice returns with catastrophic speed. Ocean waters freeze solid, glaciers advance across landscapes that hosted forests and grasslands mere months before, and the continental plates themselves shift as geological pressures created by the advancing ice force tectonic movement. This geological instability makes permanent settlement impossible across most of Fenris. Tribes must migrate constantly, following the retreating ice during summer months and withdrawing to coastal regions or island chains during winter when the continental interiors become death zones, where temperatures drop low enough to freeze exposed flesh within minutes. The population centers on scattered archipelagos and the slopes of volcanic mountains that remain ice-free year-round due to geothermal heating. These locations support the permanent settlements where tribal chieftains maintain their halls and where the young and elderly shelter during the worst of winter, while warriors hunt across the ice for the marine creatures that provide sustenance during the dark months. The Fang rises from the mountains of Asaheim, the largest of Fenris's volcanic island chains. This fortress monastery represents one of the most formidable space marine installations in the Imperium, its foundations carved directly into living rock and extending deep into the mountain's core, where geothermal vents provide power and heating. The structure predates the Imperium itself, built during the Great Crusade when Leman Russ established his legion's headquarters on the world that had raised him from infancy. The external fortifications present relatively modest profiles compared to some fortress monasteries, as much of the Fang exists underground, where it remains protected from Fenris's savage weather and any orbital bombardment that enemies might direct against it. The mountain's peak hosts landing platforms and void shield generators, while the inhabited sections descend through hundreds of levels containing training facilities, armories, gene seed repositories, and the great halls where the chapter gathers for feasts and councils. Fenrisian mythology permeates Space Wolves' culture so thoroughly that the chapter makes no meaningful distinction between tribal legends and its own traditions. The warriors recruited from Fenris's tribes arrive already steeped in stories about the Sky Warriors who descend from the heavens to claim the greatest fighters for the Allfather's eternal war. These legends describe Leman Russ not as a primarch created through gene science on Terra, but as a demigod raised by wolves who united the tribes through strength and cunning, before ascending to lead humanity's armies among the stars. The Space Wolves preserve these myths despite their factual inaccuracies, because they serve cultural functions that pure historical truth cannot replicate. Young Fenrisians understand their place in the universe through these stories, and the transition from tribal warrior to Space Wolf's battle brother flows naturally from frameworks their culture already established. The chapter's organization reflects Fenrisian tribal structures rather than the Codex Astartes patterns that most chapters follow. The great companies that form the Space Wolves' primary tactical divisions operate as extended warrior lodges led by wolf lords who maintain their positions through demonstrated prowess and the loyalty of their followers. These companies function with considerable autonomy, each developing its own traditions and combat specializations, while maintaining overall allegiance to the Great Wolf, who leads the entire chapter. The feast hall culture that dominates Space Wolves' social life mirrors the mead halls, where Fenrisian Jarls gather their warriors for celebration and storytelling. The chapter's emphasis on oral tradition and the preservation of sagas recounting the deeds of legendary warriors continues practices that Fenrisian tribes maintained for millennia before imperial contact. Cho'Garis presents a dramatically different example of successful feral world integration into imperial military culture. The planet's vast steppes stretch across entire continents, supporting nomadic populations that live entirely on horseback and measure wealth in horses rather than fixed property or material goods. Before Jagatai Khan's arrival during the Age of Strife, these nomadic tribes existed under the dominion of the Palatine, a tyrant who ruled from fortified cities using technology preserved from Cho'Garis's pre-isolation period. The Palatine's forces employed gunpowder weapons and primitive machinery that gave them overwhelming advantages over the nomadic tribes, who possessed only bows and lances, but whose mobility and tactical flexibility allowed them to survive despite their technological disadvantages. Jagatai Khan's unification of Cho'Garis began when the infant Primarch arrived on the planet through circumstances that remain unclear in historical records. The nomadic tribes discovered the child and raised him according to their customs, teaching him their ways of war and their values of freedom and speed. As he matured and his superhuman capabilities manifested, Jagatai rose to prominence among the tribes through a combination of military genius and personal prowess that earned him leadership over increasingly large confederations. His campaigns against the Palatine demonstrated tactical innovations that exploited the nomads' mobility advantages while negating the technological superiority of the city dwellers' weapons. Jagatai's forces conducted lightning raids that struck supply lines and isolated garrisons, avoiding direct confrontation with massed gunpowder weapons while gradually strangling the Palatine's ability to project power beyond his fortified strongholds. The final confrontation between Jagatai Khan and the Palatine occurred when the Primarch led a massive cavalry charge directly into the tyrant's capital city, his forces overwhelming the defenders through sheer audacity and speed that prevented effective deployment of the city's defensive weapons. The Palatine's death and the fall of his regime liberated Cho'Garis from centralized tyranny, but Jagatai chose not to replace one form of domination with another. Instead, he preserved the nomadic tribes' independence while uniting them under loose confederation that maintained their traditional ways of life. This approach reflected the Primarch's understanding that the steppes culture had produced him, and that attempting to transform Cho'Garis into a settled civilization would destroy the very characteristics that made its people formidable. The White Scars chapter that Jagatai Khan built from his legion after reuniting with the Emperor preserved Chagorian traditions with the same deliberation that the Space Wolves maintained Fenrisian customs. The chapter's combat doctrine emphasizes speed and mobility above all other considerations, reflecting the mounted warfare that dominated Chagorian military thinking. White Scar's battle brothers favor rapid strike tactics using bikes and light vehicles, rather than the methodical advance and overwhelming firepower that characterize more conventional space marine operations. The chapter maintains Chagorian cultural practices, including ritual scarring, poetry composition, and the preservation of tribal affiliations that allow battle brothers to maintain connections to their origins even after transformation into Astartes. This cultural continuity ensures that each generation of recruits from Chogoris recognizes the white scars as extensions of their own people rather than foreign conquerors who merely happen to recruit from the steppes. Caliban's classification as a feral world requires significant qualification, as the planet maintained technological and social development levels that exceeded typical feral world standards by considerable margins. The knightly orders that dominated Caliban's society possessed metallurgical capabilities, allowing them to forge sophisticated armor and weapons, constructed stone fortresses that demonstrated advanced architectural knowledge, and maintained social hierarchies based on feudal obligations rather than simple tribal structures. These characteristics technically classified Caliban as a feudal world rather than a feral world, placing it in a higher developmental category despite the planet's relative primitiveness compared to civilized imperial standards. The great beasts that inhabited Caliban's forests shaped the planet's culture as profoundly as any environmental factor. These enormous creatures, some measuring 10 meters in length with hides thick enough to turn aside all but the most powerful weapons, occupied the dense woodlands that covered most of Caliban's surface. The human population survived through constant warfare against these predators, developing the knightly traditions and martial culture that defined their civilization. Young nobles proved themselves by hunting the great beasts, and the orders maintained their prestige through demonstrated ability to protect settlements from creatures that could demolish wooden palisades and slaughter dozens of people during single attacks. The forests themselves remained largely unexplored and unmapped, as venturing too deep into the woods meant encountering beast populations in such density that even armed expeditions faced overwhelming odds. Luther and Lion L. Johnson rose to prominence on Caliban through their leadership of beast hunting campaigns that gradually pushed back the forest and expanded safe territory for human settlement. Luther, a charismatic knight who commanded respect through both martial skill and political acumen, discovered the infant Primarch in the forest after the child somehow survived alone in territory that should have killed any normal human within hours. The Primarch's superhuman capabilities manifested early, allowing him to hunt the great beasts with effectiveness that exceeded anything the knightly orders had achieved. Lion L. Johnson, as Luther named him, became the greatest beast hunter Caliban had ever known, leading expeditions that cleared entire forest regions and established new settlements in territories previously considered too dangerous for human habitation. The partnership between Luther and Lion L. Johnson transformed Caliban from a world where humans clung to scattered, fortified settlements into a unified civilization that had conquered most of the great beast populations and claimed the forests for human use. When the Emperor arrived during the Great Crusade and revealed Lion L. Johnson's true nature as a Primarch, the Lion assumed command of the First Legion and renamed them the Dark Angels. Luther remained on Caliban as the Lion's representative, charged with governing the planet and training new recruits for the Legion. This arrangement functioned successfully during the Great Crusade, with Caliban providing steady streams of warriors who brought their knightly traditions and beast-hunting experience to the Dark Angels' ranks. The Horus Heresy shattered this arrangement when Luther and a significant portion of the Dark Angels who had remained on Caliban fell to chaos corruption. The specific mechanisms of this fall remain unclear, with different accounts suggesting various causes ranging from resentment over being left behind while the Lion fought in the Great Crusade to deliberate corruption by chaos entities that exploited the frustrations of warriors who felt they deserved greater recognition. When Lion L. Johnson returned to Caliban after the Siege of Terra, he discovered that his home world had turned traitor. The resulting battle between Loyalist and traitor Dark Angels devastated the planet. Orbital bombardments and ground combat of unprecedented intensity tore Caliban apart, and a warp storm of catastrophic power consumed what remained. When the storm cleared, Caliban had ceased to exist as a coherent world, reduced to the asteroid field that Imperial records now designate as the Rock, the Dark Angels' mobile fortress monastery, constructed from the largest surviving fragment of their destroyed home world. Barbaris represents one of the most hostile environments that ever produced a feral world population, a toxic death world where poisonous gases shrouded the mountains in permanent fog, and the overlord warlords who ruled from the highest peaks commanded powers that suggested either advanced technology or sorcerous abilities beyond normal human capacity. The planet's atmosphere grew progressively more toxic with altitude, creating distinct environmental zones where different population groups survived at elevations their physiology could tolerate. The lowland valleys hosted human populations that could breathe the thinner poisons at ground level. Their bodies adapted across generations to function despite constant exposure to toxins that would kill unmodified humans within hours. These valley populations lived as slaves and subjects to the overlords, providing tribute and labor in exchange for being allowed to survive. The overlord warlords occupied the highest mountain peaks, where the atmosphere became so toxic that even the adapted lowland humans died within minutes of exposure. These beings possessed capabilities that exceeded normal human limits, whether through mutation, technological enhancement, or warp-granted powers that historical records cannot definitively determine. They commanded the lowland populations through fear and periodic descents from their mountain fortresses to collect tribute or punish resistance. The overlords maintained their positions through demonstrated invulnerability to weapons that the lowland humans possessed, their bodies either naturally resistant to primitive arms or protected by equipment that the valley populations could not penetrate or comprehend. Mortarion arrived on Barbaris as an infant primarch through the same mysterious circumstances that scattered his brothers across the galaxy. One of the overlord warlords discovered the child and raised him, perhaps intending to create a servant or simply curious about what the obviously superhuman infant might become. As Mortarion matured, his primarch physiology allowed him to survive at altitudes where even the overlords struggled, and his strength and resilience exceeded anything the warlords could match through their own enhancements. Mortarion eventually turned against his adoptive father and the other overlords, leading the lowland human populations in rebellion against their masters. His campaigns systematically eliminated the warlords one by one, as Mortarion proved capable of ascending to their mountain fortresses and killing them in direct combat despite the toxic atmosphere that should have been lethal even to his enhanced physiology. The Death Guard Legion that Mortarion commanded after reuniting with the Emperor during the Great Crusade inherited their primarch's grim endurance and his intimate familiarity with toxic warfare. The Legion recruited heavily from Barbaris, seeking warriors who possessed the natural poison resistance and psychological toughness that growing up in such a hostile environment produced. Death Guard tactics emphasized methodical advance through any conditions, accepting casualties that would break other forces while maintaining inexorable pressure on enemies who could not match their endurance. The Legion's willingness to fight in toxic environments, radioactive zones, or any other conditions that conventional forces would consider unsurvivable made them invaluable for campaigns where environmental hazards posed threats equal to or greater than enemy action. Mortarion's fall to Nurgle during the Horus Heresy transformed the Death Guard from grim but loyal servants of the Imperium into plague-ridden traitors who embodied everything their Primarch had once fought against on Barbaris. The specific circumstances of this corruption involved the Legion becoming trapped in the warp during transit, where Nurgle's plagues infected them with diseases that even their enhanced physiology could not resist. Mortarion accepted Nurgle's patronage to save his sons from complete destruction, not understanding or perhaps not caring that this bargain would transform them into the very monsters he had spent his youth destroying. The Death Guard who emerged from that warp transit bore little resemblance to the warriors who had entered it, their bodies bloated with disease and their armor corroded by supernatural decay. They had become plague marines, spreading Nurgle's gifts across the galaxy in mockery of the toxic resistance they had once used to protect humanity. These four worlds demonstrate the enormous variation in feral world characteristics and the different ways that primitive populations integrate into imperial military culture. Fenris produces warriors whose savage ferocity and pack loyalty define the Space Wolves' identity. Cho'Garis created the White Scar's emphasis on speed and independence. Caliban's knightly traditions, despite the world's destruction, continue influencing the Dark Angels through the cultural legacy that Calibanite recruits brought to the Legion before the heresy. Barbaris shaped the Death Guard's grim endurance and acceptance of toxic warfare, characteristics that persisted even after their fall to chaos, transformed them into traitors. Each world contributed unique elements to the chapters or legions that recruited from them, proving that feral world populations, despite their technological primitiveness, possess capabilities and cultural characteristics that more developed societies cannot replicate. The Imperium continues recruiting from feral worlds across the galaxy, recognizing that these primitive populations provide irreplaceable resources for both Space Marine chapters and Imperial Guard regiments. The environmental pressures that force technological regression simultaneously create selection pressures that produce physically capable, psychologically resilient populations, whose warrior traditions align naturally with Imperial military requirements. While feral worlds contribute nothing to the Imperium's industrial capacity or economic output, their human populations represent strategic assets that justify the limited resources the Administratum invests in monitoring and governing these primitive planets. As long as humanity wages constant war across the galaxy, the Imperium will continue harvesting warriors from worlds where survival itself requires the martial capabilities that civilized populations have forgotten or never possessed.